The girl in the corner wheezed with every breath, and a line hung above her head that only he could see. The prognosis was grim without intervention. He knew how to save her. He'd known since the third day. The problem was that the solution was in his head, and he himself was lying in a pit at the bottom of the settlement where he was considered prey. Let's rewind. Cold hits Daniel in the face like a fist. He opens his eyes and sees dirt. Black. Wet. Smelling of rot and iron. His hands are bound behind his back. Metal presses against his neck. A collar. He tries to breathe and chokes on the pain in his ribs. They're broken. 3 women loom over him. Leather armor with bone plates. Spears. Faces smeared with white and red clay. The one in the center is a head taller than the rest, and a scar splits her eyebrow in 2. She hurls a question. The language sounds like Korean, an ancient language, worn down by time beyond recognition. Daniel catches a single word: enemy. She asks who he is, an enemy or prey, and right then he remembers what his father used to say: if you end up in a stranger's workshop, don't touch the tools until you know who the owner is. She is the owner here. Daniel is the first to lower his gaze. No sudden movements. He says in English that he's not an enemy. She doesn't understand the words, but the spear in her hand drops lower into her palm. They yank him to his feet and drive him through the forest. The trail winds between trees as thick as 2 arm spans. Roots stick out of the ground like swollen veins. Daniel stumbles every 3rd step. The collar rubs his neck raw. The scarred warrior walks ahead and never once looks back. There are 2 more on either side. One is very young, about 18, limping but moving quickly. The other is older and calmer, and her hands smell of herbs. She is the only one who looks at Daniel not as an object, but as a challenge, like a doctor looking at a patient. He takes note of this. Around the bend, a settlement comes into view. 24 semi-dugouts with roofs of turf and leather. Smoke creeps out from the roofs, not upward but sideways, and spreads across the ground. It smells of burnt millet and wet wool. Children are coughing by the walls, and everywhere only women, young ones, old ones, not a single man. Dozens of eyes are fixed on the stranger. In some, curiosity. In others, hatred. In still others, a hunger that isn't for food. They lead him to a pit, 2 meters down. At the bottom, the water is ankle deep. The warrior woman nods, and Daniel is shoved down. A sharp pain shoots through his rib. A piece of raw flatbread flies down from above, and the pit is covered with a grate. The sky becomes square. He doesn't sleep the first night. He stands in the icy water, shivering, trying to put the fragments together into a picture. He remembers the truck. He remembers the stroller at the crosswalk. He remembers pushing it and not making it in time. Then the mud and the collar. This isn't a dream. It hurts too much to sleep. He's stuck in a pit in the middle of a settlement where there are no men, and the women speak a language he almost understands. His grandmother spoke an old dialect from Chuncheon. Half of these words might have come from there. On the second day, an old woman approaches the pit. She's gaunt, with a face like bark. Around her neck is a jade disc the size of a palm. She stares down for a long time, then gives an order to the guards. They bring another flatbread, a piece of dried meat, a hide. The old woman tosses the hide herself. Daniel catches it with his bound hands. It's warm. The meat and the hide mean the same thing. They don't intend to kill him yet. Not yet. On the third day, everything turns upside down. Daniel is crouching and counting out of habit. Neither cold nor fear can break this habit out of him. This looks through the bars at the dwelling and counts. The area of the roof, the thickness of the walls, the angle of the slope. He sees why the smoke doesn't rise. The opening is too small. There's no draft at all. The hearth is open in the middle of the room. Smoke fills everything and seeps through the cracks. The women and children breathe this in every night. That's why they're coughing. That's why half the tribe has red eyes. They're burning firewood to no avail. They're freezing and suffocating at the same time. And then something clicks in his head. Literally, like a switch. A panel flashes before his eyes. Translucent, bluish. Text in Korean. 3 lines. Development system activated. Host identified. Reward for service. Daniel closes his eyes, opens them. The panel is still there. He reaches out. His hand passes right through it. He curses in English, then in Korean. The panel flashes and displays a new line. A need detected within a 10-meter radius. A list follows. Lines hover over every person nearby, even through walls. A security guard at the entrance. Chronic lower back pain. A second one. 3 sleepless nights. A child. Chronic bronchitis. Another child. Malnutrition. A woman by the hearth. An untreated burn. The list goes on, and something tightens in Daniel's chest. He knows what poverty is. He used to work for a company that made water filters and stoves for villages in Nepal and Kenya. But it's one thing to see poverty on a business trip with a return ticket in your pocket. It's quite another to be stuck in a hole right in the middle of it with no ticket at all. The panel flashes again. Catalog. Available solutions. Level 1. Underfloor heating system. A chimney with draft. Smoking meat. Tanning hides. Treating wounds. Daniel knows all this. He's an engineer. He designed furnaces. He knows how an ondol works. His grandmother used to tell him about it. His father drew up blueprints in the garage. But now this knowledge lies before him, not as memories, but as blueprints, with dimensions, with materials, with step-by-step instructions tied to what's around him. Clay, stone, wood, everything for an ondol lies right at his feet. Daniel realizes 2 things. This isn't a delusion, and he's been given a tool. Not a weapon, not a superpower, a tool. And it works only one way, to help. The days blur together. They toss him food. He eats, shivers, counts, listens. Language comes together in his head like a mosaic of his grandmother's lullabies and his grandfather's curses. Bring some water. How much meat is left? The girl is coughing again. He hears that phrase 4 times a day. The girl is coughing again. On the 5th day, they drag him out. His legs won't hold him up. They haul him to the central hearth and toss him into smoke so thick you can't make out anyone's face. Everyone is coughing. In the corner, a girl of about 6 is wheezing, her chest heaving in jerks. The panel illuminates a line. Biju, 6 years old. Conflict collision. Without intervention, the prognosis is poor. Daniel looks at the girl, at the fire pit, at the hole in the roof through which the smoke won't escape. He turns to the guards and gestures for a piece of coal, then a flat stone. A woman who smells of herbs understands. She brings him a piece of coal and a shard of shale. Daniel falls to his knees. His hands are bound. He clutches the coal in his palms and draws. The hearth isn't in the center. It's by the wall. From it, a channel runs under the floor through the entire dwelling. Smoke travels through the channel. It warms the floor. It disappears into the chimney. The house is warm. The smoke is outside. He points his finger at the girl, then at the drawing. He presses his palm against the floor and pretends he's warm. He points to the hole in the roof and shakes his head. Smoke, not here, there. 20 pairs of eyes. Silence. Only the girl's wheezing. The old woman with the jade stares at the drawing for a long time. At the girl. At Daniel. The woman with the herbs says 2 words. Floor, warm. The old woman nods. The herbalist drops to her knees and takes out a knife. Daniel doesn't flinch. She cuts the ropes. His arms fall like whips, and blood gushes onto her fingers. It hurts. It's good. She says a name. Medio. He says his own. Da-il. She repeats it. Wrong, but close. That's enough. It takes 6 days to build the first ondol. Daniel works from dawn till dusk. His hands are free, but the collar remains in place. The women watch, first from a distance, then closer. On the 3rd day, the limping huntress brings stones without being asked. On the 4th, 3 women dig a trench along the marked line. On the 5th, even the scarred warrior arrives. She stands off to the side with her arms crossed. She says nothing, but she came. Daniel digs a trench an elbow deep across the entire dwelling. He lines it with stones, he with clay mixed with ash. He builds the hearth against the wall. He leads the chimney outside. The system illuminates every step. The angle of inclination, the thickness of the masonry, the distance between the partitions for even heat distribution. He works and feels something changing, not in the system, but within him. In America, he designs stoves for people he'd never met. Here, he's building a heated floor for a little girl who's coughing 3 meters away. On the 6th day, he lights a fire in the new hearth. The smoke flows into a duct under the floor. The stones heat up. An hour later, the floor is warm. 2 hours later, you can sit in the house without a jacket. The smoke goes up the chimney. The air is clean, for the first time. Little Biju walks over to the warm floor and sits down. Then she lies down. She presses her cheek against a heated stone and closes her eyes. And she doesn't cough, for the first time in many days. The panel flashes. Mission accomplished. Reward credited. Catalog updated. But Daniel isn't looking at the panel. He's looking at the girl. at the women who one after another sit on the floor and touch the stones with their palms. Midiu strokes Bichu's hair. The old chieftain stands frozen at the entrance, and on her face is not a smile, but something resembling the first breath after a long suffocation. The scarred warrior stands outside and does not come in, but she doesn't leave either. At night, Daniel lies in a corner of the dwelling, not in the pit, on the warm floor. The collar still presses against him, his rib aches, but the floor is warm, and the girl isn't coughing, and the old woman's voice in his memory quietly repeats a word he hasn't heard since childhood. Ondol. The morning began with a scream. Daniel jumped up from the warm floor and hit his head on a low beam. The collar clattered against the stone. A woman was screaming outside, not from pain, from anger. Daniel recognized the voice, the warrior with the scar, Yoon Hae-jin. Over the past few days, he'd learned her name, but had never once said it out loud. She was yelling at someone at the entrance to the dwelling. Daniel made out the words, a man, inside, night, shame. She was furious that he'd been allowed to sleep in the communal dwelling. A second voice replied calmly, Medio. The herbalist had said that the captive had built a heated floor, that the children weren't coughing, that this was more important than the rules. Hae-jin replied that the rules existed for a reason, that her mother had been sold by men, that she wouldn't forget that even if every floor in the settlement became heated. Then footsteps, heavy, receding. Medio went inside. She looked at Daniel. He sat in silence. She said nothing. She brought him a bowl of porridge and sat down by the hearth. The day began with work. Daniel didn't wait for instructions. He left the dwelling and began inspecting the other buildings. There were 23 of them, all equally dilapidated. Smoke inside, cold rising from the floor, cracks in the walls. The system highlighted the people's needs in each dwelling: chronic pain, coughing, frostbite, malnutrition. He walked around the entire settlement in 2 hours. The women watched him warily. Some grabbed their knives when he got too close. The collar around his neck was a visible sign. He was a prisoner, not a guest, not a human, a thing. Daniel understood this. He didn't try to smile. He didn't try to speak. He just watched. He counted. He memorized. By noon, he returned to the central dwelling and began building a second ondol, in the dwelling where 6 children slept. Miuryo was the first to come and help. Then a young, limping huntress arrived. Daniel learned her name was So-yeon. She passed the stones quickly and accurately. She limped, but didn't complain. The panel illuminated a line above her head. Old fracture of the left ankle, malunion, chronic pain syndrome. Daniel memorized and continued working. Toward evening on the second day after the ondol, a girl approached Daniel. She was small, about 12 years old, thin, with sharp elbows and eyes that burned with such curiosity that it outweighed her fear. She stopped 2 steps away from him and said something quickly. Daniel didn't understand. She repeated it more slowly. He figured it out. Why was the floor hot when there was no fire on the floor? Daniel crouched down. He took a lift and drew a simple diagram on the ground. The fire is here. The smoke goes this way. The stones are hot. The floor is hot. The fire isn't on the floor. The fire is off to the side. The girl watched. Then she nodded. Then she asked the next question, and the next, and another. In an hour, she asked more questions than the entire council of elders had in 5 days. Daniel learned that her name was Ta-i, that she was Hae-jin's younger sister, that she wanted to know everything about everything, that she wasn't allowed to talk to the prisoner, but she didn't care. She didn't say that last part outright, but it was obvious. When Hae-jin appeared and saw her sister standing next to Daniel, she grabbed her by the arm and dragged her away. Ta-i turned around as she was being led away and stuck her tongue out at Daniel. Not at him, at the situation. He almost smiled. Almost. The following days blended into a rhythm. Wake up, porridge, work, sleep. Daniel built ondols, one after another. Every dwelling, every hearth. The women were getting used to his presence. They didn't trust him, but they were getting used to him. He moved slowly. He didn't make any sudden gestures. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look anyone in the eye any longer than necessary. His survival instinct had taught him this faster than any textbook could. He was a large man among women who had every reason to fear and hate men. Every movement of his was meant to convey one thing: I am not a threat. I'm not a threat. I'm not a threat. The system understood this too. After the 4th ondol, it unlocked a new section of the catalog: smoking and preservation. Daniel knew the technology. He'd seen smokehouses in Kenya. Simple, effective. A pit, a grate, slow smoke from specific types of wood. Meat that's not for 3 days, but for 3 months. The problem with food in Taljian wasn't hunting. The hunters were good. So-yan limped but could hit a target from 30 paces. He-jin moved through the forest like a shadow. They brought back game. But the meat spoiled, quickly, slightly slower in winter. In summer, within 2 days. The tribe ate what they had hunted that day. There were no reserves. Every day began with the question of whether there would be food. Every evening ended with the same question. Daniel began building a smokehouse in the second week. He dug a pit, he stacked stones, he made a grate out of twigs. He explained to Midiu which types of wood produced the right kind of smoke: slow, cool, resin-free. The herbalist listened intently. She was the kind of person who listens not just with her ears, but with her whole body. Daniel showed her how to cut the meat into thin strips, how to hang it on the grate, how to keep the fire going for 3 days. Midiu remembered it all the first time. But Daniel didn't just build a smokehouse. He called 3 women over and taught them. It was a deliberate decision. The system made it clear. Passing on knowledge doubles the reward. But it wasn't just about the rewards. Daniel understood a simple truth. If he was the only one who knew how to smoke meat, then he was indispensable. And an indispensable captive is still a captive, just a valuable one. If 10 women knew how to do it, then he wasn't irreplaceable. He was a teacher, and teachers aren't kept on a leash. At least, that's what he hoped. The 3 women learned in a week. Midiu learned in 2 days. By the 3rd day, she was already correcting Daniel when he cut the meat into strips that were too thick. He wasn't offended. He was delighted. The panel confirmed it. Skill transfer complete. Multiplier activated. Catalog updated. New recipe available. Tanning hides, a simple, reinforced bow. The end of the 2nd week, Daniel sat by the smokehouse and watched as the smoke slowly enveloped the strips of venison. Midiu and 2 young women were sitting nearby. They were discussing something in their own language. Daniel could already understand more than half of it. They were talking about winter, about how, for the first time in 5 years, they would have a 2-month supply of meat. One of the women said something about him. Daniel caught a word: useful. The second woman corrected her. Not useful, necessary. A small difference in sound, a huge difference in meaning. A useful thing, a necessary person. Daniel didn't let on that he understood, but inside, something shifted. In the 3rd week, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. He was brought before the Council of Mothers. 5 women sat in a semicircle in the largest dwelling. The elderly chieftain Sola was in the center. Midio was on the right. He-jin was on the left. And there were 2 others. One of them was a pale woman with long black hair and eyes the color of ash. She stared at Daniel without blinking. Above her head, the panel lit up. Che Bo-ran, High Priestess, chronic seizures, concealing them. Seated next to her was a woman of about 28, quiet, with birch bark and a piece of charcoal in her hands. She mechanically scribbled something while the others spoke. The panel lit up. Harim, former court scribe of the Kingdom of Heian, an acute need for intellectual activity. So that's what it means to die of boredom, Daniel thought? The system even determines that. Sola began to speak, slowly, clearly. Daniel understood almost everything. She said that the captive had brought warmth, that the children weren't coughing, that the meat was now preserved. She asked for advice, what to do with him next. Midio said he was needed alive and free, that he knew things that could save the tribe. Heijin said that no man does anything for free, that he was biding his time, that she'd seen men like him before. Boran remained silent. Then she spoke in a whisper. She said that the spirits had brought him here for a reason, that on the day of the winter solstice, they must ask the spirits, and if the spirits speak, his blood will warm the earth better than his body. Daniel stood there and listened. He understood everything. The priestess wanted to kill him, to sacrifice him, in 2 moons, the winter solstice. He looked at Sola. The old woman was looking at him. There was no answer in her eyes, only a question. Prove that you are worth more than your blood. The council had not reached a decision. That was worse than a sentence. At least a sentence was clear. The uncertainty meant that every day could be his last. Daniel returned to his work. He had 2 months until the solstice. 2 months to become so useful that even Boran would not be able to justify his death. No, not useful. Essential. He started with Mirio. The herbalist knew hundreds of plants, but her healing methods were limited to what she'd learned from her mother and grandmother. Daniel knew nothing about medicine. He was an engineer, but the system knew, and it gave him exactly as much as he could apply right now. boiling water, sterilizing instruments over a fire, clean bandages instead of dirty rags, washing hands before treating wounds. Midiu listened. She argued. She checked. A week later, she was boiling water before every procedure and made her assistants do the same. After 2 weeks, not a single wound in the settlement had become infected, for the first time ever. Midiu didn't thank Daniel. She said something better. She said he wasn't a fool. Coming from her, it sounded like the highest praise. By the end of the first month, Daniel noticed a change. A small one, barely noticeable. Hejin still slept with a knife, but the knife wasn't next to her hand. It was under her pillow. A difference of half a second in reaction time, half a second of trust. Daniel didn't know if this should be considered progress, but he considered it so. The second month began with a freeze, a real one, the kind that cracks the bark off trees and freezes water in buckets overnight. Daniel woke up because the collar was burning his neck with cold. The metal absorbed the frost and held onto it like a sponge. The skin beneath the collar had formed a crust from constant friction, and now that crust was cracking in the cold. It hurt. It hurt every morning. He got up and went outside. The settlement was white. The first snow had fallen during the night. Thin, prickly, not a beautiful winter blanket, but a vicious, icy dust clogging every crevice. The women were moving faster than usual. They were bringing in firewood, checking the roofs, herding the goats into shelter. Daniel saw So-Yun. The young hunter was dragging a bundle of kindling and limping more than usual. The cold was intensifying the pain in her old fracture. The panel highlighted it in red. Pain syndrome, flare-up. Daniel looked away. He remembered. But right now, there were more important things to do. The problem lay in the walls. The ondol heated the floor. The chimney vented the smoke. But the walls of the dwellings remained as they were, woven twigs coated with clay, thin, full of cracks. Heat escaped through them faster than the ondol could replace it. The women were burning twice as much firewood as necessary. The wood supply was dwindling. Daniel could see it in their faces. By the way, Sola would scan the woodpile with her eyes every morning. By the way, the hunters ventured farther and farther into the forest in search of deadwood. The system suggested a solution, a double wall. 2 wattle walls with a gap stuffed with dry moss and leaves. Simple insulation, earthen, ancient, effective. Daniel started with one dwelling. He demonstrated the principle to So-Yun and the other 2 women. So-Yun understood in a minute. She understood everything quickly, in general. Her problem wasn't her mind, but her leg, and the fact that the tribe saw her as a second-rate hunter because of her limp. The work on insulation took a week and a half. Daniel didn't do everything himself. He demonstrated. He explained. He drew with charcoal on the stones. Then he stepped back and watched as the women did it themselves. He corrected them if necessary. He praised them when they got it right. The system generously awarded points for every technique taught. The catalog grew. But Daniel tried not to think of the catalog as a goal. The goal was something else. In 6 weeks, it would be the solstice. And every evening, the pale priestess with ash-gray eyes would look in his direction and move her lips. A prayer or a verdict, he couldn't make it out. In the 3rd week of the 2nd month, Daniel did the first thing that changed not his daily life, but his attitude. He noticed that Hejin grimaced every morning when she put on her shoulder guard, a leather plate fastened over her left shoulder to protect against the recoil of the spear. Old, stiff, poorly sewn. The panel lit up. Chronic skin irritation, subclavian region, contact dermatitis. She'd been hiding it for 2 years. 2 years. For 2 years, she'd worn a shoulder guard that rubbed her skin raw and kept quiet. Because complaining meant being weak. And for Hejin, being weak meant becoming what her mother had become, a commodity. Daniel said nothing. He went to Mirio. He asked for a piece of soft, tanned leather. He asked for sewing thread for sewing. The herbalist gave them to him without asking questions. She had long since stopped asking why. She trusted the process. Daniel worked for 2 evenings. The system suggested the shape, anatomically correct, taking into account the female shoulder joint, with a soft lining of double-layered leather, distributing pressure not to a single point, but across the entire area from the collarbone to the shoulder blade. He finished it that night. In the morning, he placed the shoulder pad at the entrance to Hejin's dwelling. Silently, he left. He didn't see her find it, didn't see her try it on, didn't see her move her shoulder and realized it didn't hurt. For the first time in 2 years, it didn't hurt. He didn't see her lock herself in her hut, but he heard it. He was walking by and heard it. A quiet sound, ragged, muffled. She was crying. Yoon Hye-jin, the warrior who hadn't cried in front of others since she was 7. She was crying alone, because someone had made something for her that didn't cause pain. Daniel stopped. He sat down on the ground with his back against the wall of her hut, and he sat there, silently, for a long time, until the sounds subsided. Then he stood up and left. She came out a minute later. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stony. She saw the imprint on the ground where he had been sitting. She looked in the direction he had gone. She said nothing. But the next day, something happened that had never happened before. Heijin brought Daniel a bowl of porridge. By herself. She silently set it down in front of him. She silently sat down beside him. She silently ate her portion. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. She just sat there beside him. To anyone else, it wouldn't have meant a thing. To Heijin, it was like an open door. Narrow, heavy, but open. Winter was growing harsher. The temperature was dropping. The winds were picking up. The hunters were returning empty-handed more and more often. The game was heading south, a common story in these parts. But this year, the supply of smoked meat made the difference between hunger and satiety. The tribe ate, not to their fill, but they ate every day. It was unusual. Daniel could see it in their faces. The women didn't know how to react to the absence of their usual fear. They had grown up with the fear of hunger like a shadow. When the shadow disappeared, they didn't feel relief. They felt unease, as if something were wrong, as if it were the calm before the storm. Daniel understood this. He had seen the same thing in the villages of Kenya. People accustomed to deprivation don't believe in stability. Stability seems like a trap to them. In the 5th week, Daniel decided to talk to Bo-Ran. It was a risk. The priestess hated him, or pretended to hate him. He wasn't sure. The panel displayed a strange line above her. Chronic seizures, hiding, afraid. Daniel knew what that meant. Epilepsy, or something very similar. Seizures that, in this world, were mistaken for visions of spirits. At 14, the girl was declared the chosen one and made a priestess, not because she believed, but because her body shook and her eyes rolled back. Bo-Ran had lived with this lie for 10 years. On every sacred day, she wasn't afraid that the spirits wouldn't come. She was afraid that a seizure would strike, and that one day, someone would realize that this wasn't a gift, but an illness, and then everything she was would crumble. Daniel approached her that evening. She was sitting alone by the sacred stone at the edge of the settlement, pale, with dark circles under her eyes. He sat down beside her, not too close. She didn't look at him. She told him he wasn't allowed to approach the sacred place. He replied that he knew, and that he needed to tell her something. She asked what. He said he knew about the seizures. Silence. Long. Cold. Like a winter wind. Bo-Ran turned toward him. There was something in her ashen eyes that made Daniel feel uneasy. Not fear, not anger. Vulnerability. He saw a person who had been caught. She asked how he knew. He said he could see that where he came from, it was a disease. Not a gift, not a curse, a disease, and it could be cured. Bo-Ran was silent. Then she asked why he wanted to do this. He replied that he didn't need to, that it was her body and her right, that he wouldn't tell anyone, that he could try to help, if she'd let him. She didn't let him. Not that evening. She got up and left. But the next day, Daniel found a small stone by his spot. White, smooth, a river stone. In Talgyon, people placed such stones at the threshold when they wanted to say, "Come." He came, in the evening, to the sacred stone. Bo-Ran was sitting in the same spot. She said one word, "Try." The system suggested a decoction made from the bark of a local tree. Daniel knew that on Earth, epilepsy was treated with bromides and later with barbiturates. They didn't have those here. But the system had adapted. It had found a plant in the local flora with a mild anticonvulsant effect, the bark of the mountain ash. A specific concentration, a specific brewing method. Daniel memorized the recipe and went to Midiu. He asked for the bark. He didn't explain why. Midiu gave it to him without asking any questions. She trusted him. That trust never ceased to amaze him. Daniel simmered the decoction for 3 nights. He adjusted the concentration. The system made corrections. Too weak. Stronger. A little less. That's it. On the 4th night, he brought the finished decoction to Bo-Ran. She drank it without asking what was in it. It was either recklessness or trust, or desperation. In a week, she was due to have her sacred day. Once a lunar cycle, every tribe would gather at the sacred stone, and the priestess would enter a trance. She would receive visions. She spoke in the voice of the spirits. Every time, Bo-Ran dreaded this day, because the trance was a seizure, and a seizure was humiliating, painful, terrifying. This time, the sacred day came and went. Bo-Ran went out to the stone. She closed her eyes. She waited. Nothing. No convulsions, no shaking, no foaming at the mouth. For the first time in 10 years, her body obeyed her, not the illness. She stood before the tribe and spoke, calmly, steadily, in her own words, not the words of the seizure. No one but her and Daniel knew the difference, but she knew. That evening, she went to him. She asked if he had known all along. He replied that he had known. She asked why he had kept silent. He replied that it was her story, not his. There were 2 weeks left until the solstice. Daniel didn't know what Boran had decided. She didn't speak. She gave no signs. She looked at him with those same ashen eyes. But stones began to appear at his doorstep every morning, white, smooth, river stones. He gathered them and stacked them in a corner. He didn't know why. He just gathered them. The snow was already knee-deep. The forest around the settlement had grown quiet, dead. The birds had flown away. The game had migrated south. The hunters had returned empty-handed for 3 days in a row. The supply of smoked meat was running low. Daniel did the math in his head. At the current rate of consumption, it would last 4 weeks. Then hunger. Old Sola knew this as well as he did. Every morning, she stood by the woodpile and the meat storeroom. She counted. She said nothing. Her gaze grew heavier with each passing day. The system highlighted a new section of the catalog. Traps for small game. Not hunting weapons, not things that kill, things that catch. Snares, nooses, baited pits. Daniel studied the diagrams and went to see He-Jin. This was the first time he'd spoken to her directly. She was standing at the weapons rack, sharpening the tip of a spear, wearing a new shoulder strap. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He explained the idea, not to chase game through the forest, but to set dozens of traps along the trails, check them every morning. Small game, hares, partridges, not a deer that would feed everyone for 3 days, but 10 hares every day, consistently, predictably. He-Jin listened. Her face was stony. Then she said that Taojian hunters don't set traps. Only cowards set traps. A real hunter takes her prey in fair combat. Daniel replied that fair combat is good, but hungry children are bad. He-Jin clenched her jaw. The muscles in her cheekbones twitched. She said nothing. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel decided he'd failed. But the next morning, Soyeon was standing outside his dwelling with a skein of twine and a bundle of twigs. She said He-Jin had sent her to learn how to set traps. Daniel taught Soyeon and 4 other female hunters for 2 days. He showed them how to tie snares, how to find animal trails, how to set snares so that the animal wouldn't see or smell them. Soyeon picked it up instantly. Her hands were quick and precise despite her limp. She moved through the forest quietly and deftly. Her leg kept her from running, but it didn't keep her from thinking. And setting traps required more brain power than legwork. On the 3rd day, they checked their first snares, 7 hares, 4 partridges, enough food for the whole tribe for the day. Soyeon laughed, loudly, like a child. She ran back to the settlement with the hares on her shoulders, limping and laughing, and for the first time, Daniel thought that sound was better than any signal from the system. He-Jin didn't admit that the traps were a good idea, not out loud, but every morning she checked the 2 snares on the distant trail, the ones Daniel had set beyond the usual route, a dangerous trail. Close to the border of the Charpaltan territory, she checked them herself. She didn't send Soyeon. She didn't send anyone. She went alone, because it was dangerous, and she took on the dangerous tasks herself. Daniel found out about this from Ta-I. He-Jin's younger sister told him in passing, while asking her usual 200 questions an hour. She said that her sister left every morning before dawn, alone, toward the border. Daniel didn't ask why. He already knew. He-Jin was protecting, not him, but the tribe, his traps, the food they provided. She couldn't say thank you, but she could stand between the danger and what he had created. The solstice was approaching. 10 days, then 7, then 5. The atmosphere in the settlement was changing. The women were preparing for the sacred day. Boran was conducting rituals. Every evening at the sacred stone, singing, smoke from herbs, circles of white clay on the ground. Daniel watched from a distance. He didn't know what she had decided. Stones appeared at his doorstep every morning, but that could mean anything. Come, say goodbye, get ready. He worked. It was the only thing he knew how to do with fear. Push it inside and work with his hands. He finished the last ondols in the small dwellings on the edge of the settlement. He repaired 3 roofs. He made new door frames. He insulated the goat pen. Every day, the system credited him with rewards. The catalog grew. Daniel hardly ever looked at it. He watched the people. At Bichu, who no longer coughed and ran between the dwellings with the other children. At Miru, who for the first time in 20 years slept until dawn because no sick child woke her up at night. At Ta'i, who brought him a new question every day as a gift. At Harim, who sat in the corner and drew with charcoal on birch bark. A map of the settlement, a map of the traps, a map of everything that was changing. She documented, quietly, unobtrusively, but she documented it. 3 days before the solstice, Daniel made a gift for Harim. He spent a week on it, working in bits and pieces between his main tasks. Paper. Real paper. Not birch bark, not stone. Paper made from bark and rags. The system provided the recipe. Soak the bark of a specific tree. Break it down into fibers. Mix with water and scraps of cloth. Strain through a frame covered with cloth. Dry. He made 5 sheets. Thin, uneven, with flecks of bark. But it was paper. He made a quill from bone and ink from soot mixed with resin. He placed it all where Harim usually sat. Silently, he left. He didn't see her find it, didn't see her pick up a sheet and run her fingers over the surface. He didn't see her freeze. But in the morning, a neatly folded sheet lay on his pillow, covered in small, beautiful hieroglyphs. He couldn't read it all. The hand script was different from what he knew, but a few lines were in Old Korean, that very one, his grandmother's, about a man who came empty-handed and filled the void. Daniel sat and stared at the sheet for a long time. 2 days until the solstice. Boran came to him at night, quietly, like a shadow. The village was asleep. She stood at the entrance and watched. Daniel wasn't asleep. He had rarely slept lately. She said the council would decide tomorrow, that Sola would ask for her opinion, that his life depended on her word. Daniel remained silent. Boran said that she used to want him dead, because that's how it's supposed to be, because the spirits demand it. Because a man in Talgyan is either a sacrifice or a slave, and there are no other options. Then she fell silent, and she said that now she doesn't know what the spirits are saying, because for the first time in 10 years, she hears silence instead of thunder in her head. And in that silence, there is no voice demanding blood. There is only her own voice, and it is silent. Daniel asked what her own voice would say if she gave it a chance to speak. Boran didn't answer. She walked off into the darkness, quietly, just as she had come. The day of the solstice, the shortest day, the longest night. The entire tribe had gathered at the sacred stone. 80 people, women, children, and 1 man in a collar. Daniel stood in the center of the circle. His hands were free, his legs were free, a collar around his neck. Sola sat on the chieftain's stone. Heijin stood to his right with a spear, Midiu to his left. Bodan stood before the sacred stone. Her face was pale, her hair was black, her eyes were closed. She began to speak, quietly, but everyone heard every word. She spoke of spirits, of ancestors, of winter, of blood. Daniel listened and understood every word. His Korean had become nearly fluent in just 2 months. Boran said that the spirits demanded a sacrifice, that winter would not retreat without blood, that it had always been this way. Then she fell silent. She opened her eyes, she looked at Daniel, and she said that the spirits were telling her something new, that there are different kinds of blood, that there is blood that flows from the body, and there is blood that flows from the hands, sweat, labor, calluses. She lifted Daniel's hands. She showed his palms to the whole tribe. Calluses, scrapes, burns, cracks from the cold. Hands that had worked for 2 months without stopping. Boran said that these hands had already paid the price, that the spirits had accepted his sacrifice, that the blood on his palms was more precious than the blood from his throat. Silence. A long silence. Daniel stood there, breathing. Every breath felt like the first. Sola stood up, slowly. She looked at the council, at Midio. Midio nodded. At Heijin. The warrior was silent, for a long time. Then she nodded once, briefly, without looking at Daniel, at Boran. The priestess stood calmly, quietly, the first sacred day without convulsions. The first time her words were truly her own. Soleil announced the decision. The captive would remain, alive. The solstice had passed. Daniel exhaled. His legs buckled. He sat down right in the snow. No one helped him up. But no one kicked him either. Ta'i ran up and pressed a hot flatbread wrapped in a rag into his hand. She ran back away. Daniel sat in the snow and ate the hot bread, the collar pressed against his neck. But he was alive. He was alive, and winter was in full swing, and he sat in the snow among 8-10 women who had decided not to kill him. For now. After the solstice, something changed. Not on the outside. Outside, it was still the same winter, the same snow, the same cold. What had changed was inside the settlement, in the air, in the way the women looked at Daniel. Not trust, not yet, but an absence of hostility, as if someone had removed the thin glass wall between him and the others. The children were the first to stop being afraid. Biju began to follow him around just like Ta'i. 2 girls, one 6 years old, the other 12. One asked questions, the other just walked beside him and held onto his sleeve. Daniel got used to it. Mirio came to him on the 3rd day after the solstice with a request. Not a request, a demand. She said she needed assistance, that for 20 years she had been healing the tribe alone, that every child's death was her fault because she couldn't keep up. She couldn't be in 2 places at once. She couldn't go without sleep every night. She said this flatly and dryly, without self-pity, like a report. The panel illuminated her. Chronic exhaustion, insomnia, suppressed guilt, 20 years of suppressed guilt. Daniel said he would help, that the system had already assigned him a module on basic medicine, hygiene, wound care, basic anatomy, symptoms of common diseases. He could train 3 or 4 women. Mirio could choose the most capable ones. In a month, she'd have assistance. In 3 months, they'd be able to work on their own. Mirio looked at him for a long time. Then she said that if he was lying, she'd personally cut out his liver. Daniel replied that he wasn't lying. She nodded. That was their agreement. Mirio chose 4. 2 young hunters who were tired of hunting, 1 elderly woman with steady hands, and So Young, a young hunter with a limp who volunteered herself. She said her legs were bad, but her hands were good, and so was her head. Mirio agreed. Daniel began teaching them every evening after their regular work: boiling water, sterilization, clean hands, clean instruments, bandaging, splinting fractures, signs of inflammation, signs of dehydration, signs of frostbite, simple things, mundane, obvious to anyone who had taken a first aid course in America, revolutionary for a tribe where wounds were treated with dirty rags and prayers. So-Yun turned out to be the best student, quick, precise. She remembered things the first time. She asked the right questions, not the ones that come to mind immediately, but the ones that come to mind after some thought. Daniel noticed this and began teaching her more advanced topics: joint anatomy, bone structure, and how to detect a fracture by touch. So-Young listened, her eyes ablaze. She had found her calling, not as a hunter, but as a healer. 2 weeks later, Midiu fell asleep before midnight for the first time. One of her students was on duty in her place. Nothing happened. No one had died. In the morning, Midiu woke up and checked on all the patients first thing. Everyone was fine. She stood in the middle of the dwelling, not knowing what to do. She couldn't remember the last time she'd woken up without panic, without the feeling that she was too late, that someone had died while she slept. She went to see Daniel that evening. She brought herbal tea. She said she wanted to talk. The 2 of them sat by the hearth. Midiu spoke about her husband. For the first time in 20 years, she was talking about him to someone. His name was Gonyu. He was quiet, calm. He made clay pots, the best in Talgyon. He was killed in the Chorpaltan raid when she was 22. She didn't see him die. They brought her his hands. That was how death was confirmed in Talgyon. A master's hands are returned to his family. For 20 years, she had kept his last pot, unfinished, with the imprint of his thumb on the clay. She told this story in an even voice, without tears. The tears had dried up long ago. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened, the way no one had listened to her for 20 years. When she finished, he said one thing, that Gonyu would have made good teapots. Midiu looked at him, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. A small, sad, genuine smile. They sat until dawn, drinking tea, in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but the silence was warm. The end of the 2nd month, winter began to recede, slowly, reluctantly, but the sun lingered in the sky a little longer. The snow had softened. The first streams began to flow down from the hills. Daniel stood by the stream and thought. The system highlighted a new section: water supply, wells, canals, filtration. The tribe drank water from the stream. the very same stream into which mud from the hill flowed upstream, the very same stream from which the animals drank. Daniel knew where this would lead: dysentery, intestinal infections, infant mortality. Half of the tribe's illnesses began with the water. Mirio treated the symptoms. Daniel could eliminate the cause. He began digging a well. He chose the spot according to the system, a low-lying area between two dwellings. The groundwater was shallow. A layer of clay acted as a natural filter. He dug for 3 days. With Yun helped. Then more women came. Then Ta'i arrived with a wooden shovel she had carved herself. It was crooked and awkward, but she'd carved it herself. Daniel lined the well walls with stone. He made a cover out of planks to keep debris and animals out. He built a simple gate out of a log and rope. On the 4th day, water began to flow from the well, clean, clear, cold, and odorless. Miru was the first to taste it. Then Sola tasted it. The old woman held the water in her mouth for a long time. Then she swallowed. She looked at Daniel. She said the water was good. Simply, without fanfare, the water was good. Daniel nodded. In the 3rd month, something happened that Daniel hadn't expected. Sola convened a council, a full one, all 5 women, and Daniel was summoned, not as a prisoner. He was summoned as a witness. Sola spoke. She said that winter was almost over, that not a single child had died. For the first time in 20 years, not a single child. She repeated this twice. Her voice didn't waver, but her hands on the jade disc had turned white from how tightly she was gripping it. Not a single child. She said that the heated floors had saved lives, that the smoked meat had saved them from starvation, that the traps had provided stability, that the clean water from the well had been available for a week now, and not a single child had had an upset stomach. She listed all this, looking not at Daniel, but at the council. Then she said that the collar around the neck of the man who had done all this brought shame not on him, but on Talgon. Heijin stood up. Everyone fell silent. The warrior stood there, staring straight ahead, not at Daniel, not at Sola, at the wall. She said that the collar was the law, that the law protected the tribe, that without the law, they were no different from those who had sold their mothers. Then she fell silent, for a long time. Then she said that the law was meant to protect, but the collar on this man no longer protected. It got in the way. It prevented him from working. It prevents him from breathing. It prevents her from looking at him without shame. She spoke the last word more quietly than the rest. Shame. Yoon Hae-jin said aloud that she was ashamed. Daniel didn't move. He wasn't breathing. Bodan said the spirits didn't mind. Mirio said it was long overdue. Harim didn't say anything. She just was taking notes, writing everything down, every word, for the chronicle. Sola approached Daniel. She pulled a small key from behind her belt. It was made of iron, rusty. It had been hanging from her belt since day 1. Daniel had seen it before, but didn't know which lock it fit. Now he knew. Sola inserted the key into the lock on the collar. She turned it. A click. The metal hoop opened and fell to the floor. Heavy. A dull thud against the stone. Daniel raised his hand to his neck. His skin was raw, red, eaten away by rust and sweat. 3 months. 90 days the collar had been pressing against his throat. And now it was gone. The air touched his bare skin, and it hurt. And it felt good. Sola said that from this day forward, he was no longer a prisoner. He was a Kesaram, an outsider. Not a guest, not one of their own, but not a slave either. A human. Daniel wanted to say thank you, but his throat tightened. He just nodded. That evening, he sat alone by the hearth. He touched his neck. He stroked the red mark left by the collar. Ta'i came over and sat down beside him. She looked at his neck. She frowned. She said it would leave an ugly scar. Daniel replied that it was fine, that scars were nothing, signs that you'd survived. Ta'i thought for a moment. Then she said her sister had a scar too, on her eyebrow. She wasn't ashamed of it. Daniel said she was right to feel that way. Ta'i was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that her sister had smiled that evening when no one was looking. Ta'i had seen it. She always saw it. Daniel didn't say anything, but something inside him grew warmer. Not because of the Ondola, because of something else. Spring came the following week. Not the calendar kind, the real kind. The snow began to melt for real. The streams swelled. The earth emerged from beneath the white, black, wet, alive. Daniel stood at the edge of the settlement and looked out at the forest. The trees were bare, but something was already stirring in the branches. The birds were returning. The game was coming back. The system highlighted dozens of new possibilities: agriculture, crop rotation, a vegetable garden, irrigation. Each of these possibilities could change the tribe's life forever, not just for one winter, forever. But Daniel wasn't looking at the panel. He was looking at the settlement behind him. 23 dwellings with heated floors, a smokehouse, a well, snares in the forest. 80 people, not a single one of whom had died this winter. Women, children, and one man without a collar, with a mark on his neck, with calluses on his hands, with his grandmother's words in his memory. Ondol. The system flashed, a new access level. The catalog expanded. Structures for tilling the soil, water mechanisms, reinforced structures for dwellings, window openings. Daniel closed the panel. Tomorrow. Everything tomorrow. Today, he just stood there and breathed, without a collar, the spring air, and that was enough. Spring hit Talgon like a fistful of life. The snow melted in 10 days. Streams turned into torrents. The earth cracked open and gave off a scent that made Daniel's head spin. He had forgotten that scent. Wet earth, rotting leaves, roots, life that had survived the winter and was now bursting forth. The women felt it too. Their movements grew faster, their voices louder. Children darted between the dwellings shouting. Bijou ran barefoot through the mud, laughing. 3 months ago, she'd been wheezing in a corner, unable to breathe. Now she was running barefoot through the mud and laughing. Daniel watched her and thought that for that sound alone, it had been worth sitting in the pit. He started with the soil. Literally. The system displayed detailed instructions on soil preparation right in front of him. Not complicated. Not the kind that requires tractors and fertilizer. Simple. Down to earth. The kind that had worked for thousands of years before tractors were invented. Choose a plot. A south-facing slope. Maximum sun. Protection from the wind. Clear it. Dig it over. Break up the clods. Daniel found a spot on the eastern edge of the settlement. A gentle hill facing south. A stream below for irrigation. The forest provided shelter from the north wind. Perfect. He went to Sola and explained. Food from the ground, not hunting, not traps. The earth. Plants you plant in the spring and harvest in the fall. Every year. Predictable. Stable. Sola listened. She didn't know what farming was. The Talgin were hunters and gatherers. Always. The idea that food could be grown rather than found or killed was as foreign to her as the idea that water could be made rather than gathered. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked one thing. The children would be fed. Daniel said yes. She nodded. That was enough. Daniel spent 3 days digging the first field, alone, with his hands and a digging stick he'd made from a branch and a flat stone. The system showed him how to make a hoe, but he had no metal, only stone and wood. On the second day, Soyeon came. Silently, she took a second stick and began digging beside him. On the third day, 4 more women. On the fourth day, Haejin arrived. She didn't dig. She stood and watched. Then she said it was a waste of energy, that the earth doesn't produce meat. Daniel replied that the earth produces millet, turnips, beans, onions, the very things used to make the porridge she ate every morning. Haejin opened her mouth, then closed it. She had never stopped to think about where the millet came from. The tribe traded for it from neighboring clans in exchange for hides and bone. Every year, they gave away what they had hunted in exchange for what they could grow themselves. Daniel said this out loud. Haejin was silent. Then she picked up a stick and began to dig. She dug furiously, as if the earth were an enemy, but she dug. A week later, the field was ready. 6 rows, long, even. Daniel laid them out according to the system, the distance between rows, the depth of the furrows, and their orientation relative to the sun. Seeds were a problem. The tribe had no seeds to plant. They bought millet ready-made. They gathered wild beans. Daniel solved this problem differently. He sent Medio and Soyeon into the forest with a detailed list: wild grains, root vegetables, and legumes. The system determined what could be cultivated from the local flora. They brought back a sack of wild seeds in 2 days. The millet was wild, but usable. The beans were small, but viable. The wild turnip was bitter, but edible. The wild onions were so pungent they brought tears to your eyes. Daniel sorted the seeds. He soaked them. He tested their germination using a simple method. He dropped them in water. The ones that sank were alive. The ones that floated were dead. Soyeon watched this as if it were a magic trick. She asked how he knew. Daniel replied that his grandmother had taught him. It was true. His grandmother had told him how her mother had planted radishes in bomb craters after the war. Soyeon didn't know what a bomb was, but she realized that Daniel's grandmother was a strong woman. Planting took 2 days. Daniel demonstrated every step to each woman: depth, distance, watering. He wasn't just planting, he was teaching. The system doubled the reward for every technique passed on. The catalog grew. But Daniel wasn't thinking about the catalog. He was thinking that in 3 months, these garden beds would yield food, and that in a year, the tribe would have its own seeds, and in 10 years, and in 100. 1 field, 6 garden beds. On top of that, it wouldn't end with his death. That thought was heavier than a collar and warmer than an ondol. Alongside the field, Daniel set to work on a watermill. The stream below the settlement had a sufficient drop in elevation. The system provided a blueprint: simple, wooden, a vertical wheel with blades, a shaft, millstones made of 2 flat stones, all made from local materials, wood and stone. He spent 2 weeks building the mill. Tae didn't leave his side for a moment. She asked questions. Why does the wheel turn? Why does the water push the blades? Why do the stones grind the grain? Daniel explained, patiently, in detail. He drew diagrams on the ground. I memorized it and retold it to the other children. By the end of the 2nd week, 6 children understood how a water wheel worked. Tae knew it better than some of the engineering students Daniel remembered from college. The mill started working on the 17th day. The wheel turned, the millstones creaked. The first handful of wild pro was turned into flour, coarse, with husks, but flour nonetheless. Mi-ryu took a handful and rubbed it between her fingers. She sniffed it. She tasted it on her tongue. Then she looked at Daniel in a way that made him feel awkward. There was something in her eyes that he didn't know the name of. Not gratitude, not admiration. Understanding. She understood the magnitude of it. Not the mill, not the flour, but what lay behind it all. Freedom from trading with neighboring clans. Freedom from dependence. Freedom from the fear that the grain wouldn't be delivered and the children would go hungry. 1 mill, 2 millstones, and a whole world turned upside down. In between tasks, Daniel set about doing what he'd been putting off for 2 months: Soyeon's foot. He studied her gait. The scan provided an accurate picture: a broken ankle. Improper healing. The bone had fused with a 3-degree misalignment. Her foot caved inward with every step. Compensatory strain on the knee and hip. Chronic pain. Soyeon had endured this her whole life. She trained at night so no one would see her weakness. She ran until she was exhausted. She fell, she'd get back up. She'd run again. The scan showed that without correction, in 5 years, she wouldn't be able to walk without a cane. In 10, she wouldn't be able to walk at all. Daniel didn't tell her that. He did something else. The system suggested a solution: an orthopedic insole. Not plastic, not silicone, made from materials available here. Tanned leather, multi-layered, with a stiff heel section made of tree bark, with a soft arch made of compressed moss, shaped from a precise cast of her foot. Daniel asked Soyeon to stand on the wet clay. She asked why. He said it was for her shoes. She stood there. He took the impression. He worked on the insole for 4 evenings. He adjusted it. He reworked it. The system corrected the angle, the thickness, and the stiffness. On the 5th evening, he gave her the finished pair. He told her to put them in her moccasins and try walking around. Soyeon put them on. She stood up. She took a step, a second, a third. She stopped. Her expression changed. It was as if someone had lifted the heavy stone she'd been carrying on her shoulders since birth. She wasn't limping. Her foot was level. For the first time in her life, her foot was level. She walked faster. Then she ran, along the path beside the settlement, past the dwellings, past the mill, past the field. She ran without limping. Daniel stood and watched. Soyeon ran to the end of the path and back. Then she stood in front of him, breathing heavily, her eyes wet. She said she thought she'd been born broken. Daniel replied that she'd been born normal. It was just that no one had made her the right shoes. Soyeon sat down in the grass and cried, loudly, without holding back, like a child who had finally been allowed to cry. Tae ran over and sat down next to her. She hugged her. Bichu ran over and sat down on the other side. 3 girls, 19, 12, 6. They sat in the grass. One of them was crying, and the other 2 were holding her. Daniel left quietly. This was their moment, not his. 3 days later, Soyeon outran Haejin on a jog, for the first time in her life. Haejin stopped and watched her go. There was no anger on her face. There was surprise, and something else, something like pride. She turned toward Daniel, who was standing by the mill, watching. Their eyes met. Heijin didn't say anything. She just nodded, once, briefly, and walked away. But there was more in that nod than in all the words she hadn't spoken in 3 months. The 4th month. The garden beds yielded their first sprouts, green, delicate, as fragile as hope. Daniel went to the field every morning and checked every row. So-yeon went with him. She took charge of the watering, every day, without fail. In her new insoles, she moved confidently and quickly. The other hunters looked at her differently, not as a lame woman, as an equal. That changed everything. Daniel thought about protection, not from winter, from people. The Talgyon were standing on territory that the Cholpaltan clan considered its own. The Iron Eight, a warrior clan, masculine, brutal. They came every year. They took whatever they wanted. Women, food, hides. The Talgyon paid them off, each time giving up a portion of what they couldn't afford to part with. Heijin spoke of this through gritted teeth. Every Cholpaltan raid was a personal insult to her. She wanted to fight, but 80 women and children against 200 warriors? That's not a fight. It's a massacre. Daniel approached the problem as an engineer, not as a warrior, not as a strategist, as an engineer. The system refused to provide blueprints for offensive weapons, but defensive structures were another matter. Walls, towers, lookout posts, the alarm system. Daniel mapped out the terrain in his mind. Talgyon stood in a valley between 2 hills, forest on 3 sides, a stream on the 4th. 1 road, 1 trail. 2 animal trails wide enough for a person to pass through. 4 entry points. 4 points that needed to be controlled. He started with the watchtowers, 3 of them, on the hills and on a large tree by the stream. Simple, wooden, a platform 5 meters above the ground, a roof to keep out the rain, a ladder that could be pulled up. From each watchtower, 2 others were visible, a signaling system, smoke during the day, fire at night. 1 bonfire means movement along the border. 2 bonfires mean armed men. 3 bonfires mean a raid. Daniel explained the system to Heijin. She listened in silence. When he finished, she asked who would be on duty. He said it was her decision. She assigned the duty rosters that very day. 6 hunters, 2 shifts, around the clock. From that day on, Talgyon was no longer blind. Then came the bows. The system gave its permission. A bow for hunting. Defense through readiness, not aggression. Daniel knew that Talgyon's bows were poor, short, weak, made from a single piece of wood. They had a range of 20 paces. Inaccurate. The system provided a blueprint for a composite bow, not a Mongolian one, simpler. 2 layers of different types of wood, a hard outer layer, a flexible inner layer, glued together with fish glue, wrapped in tendons. The bow shoots 50 paces, accurately, powerfully. The arrow pierces leather armor. Daniel made the first prototype in a week. He showed it to Heijin. She took the bow, pulled the string, took aim, fired. The arrow flew twice as far as it did from the old bow. It struck the tree trunk and sank 3 fingers deep. Heijin lowered the bow. She looked at it, then at Daniel. She said 1 word, more. Daniel made 10 more in 2 weeks. Heijin began training them, every day. The 20 best female hunters. Stationary shooting, shooting on the move, volley shooting on command. She was tough, demanding, merciless toward mistakes, but effective. Within a month, the 20 women of Talgyon could hit a target the size of a head from 40 steps away. So-yeon was the best. The insole gave her a stability she'd never had before. She stood steady, aimed calmly, shot accurately. The 5th month, the first news from the outside. A hunter named Dan B returned from a long reconnaissance mission and sounded the alarm. The Cholpaltan were preparing. She had seen their camp, larger than usual. 60 warriors, maybe 70. This wasn't a routine raid for tribute. It was something else. Dan B said she'd heard them talking about a sorcerer, a fair-skinned man in Talgyon who performs miracles. They wanted either him or his head. Daniel listened and felt a chill run down his spine. Rumors. He hadn't been thinking about rumors. He'd been building and teaching and had forgotten that there was a world beyond the forest, and that world had heard of him. Heijin convened a war council. For the first time, Daniel sat not as a witness, but as an advisor. Heijin spoke briefly. The Cholpaltan are coming. The question was when. The answer? Soon. Daniel proposed a plan. Not a battle, a defense. 4 entry points. Block 3, leave 1 open, the one that leads through the narrow ravine between the hills. Lure them in. Archers on the slopes, fire from above. The Cholpaltan are used to the Talgyon fleeing or surrendering. They don't expect resistance. That's their weakness. Heijin listened. She asked how many they would lose. Daniel said that if everything went according to plan, the casualty count would be 0. Heijin looked at him. There was a shadow of distrust in her eyes. 0 casualties in battle is a fairy tale, not reality. Daniel said this wasn't a battle, it was a trap. He looked at Soyeon. Like a trap for hares, only bigger. Soyeon smiled. Heijin didn't smile, but she nodded. The preparations took 3 weeks. Daniel worked non-stop. 3 trails were blocked with barricades, trees, rocks, thick, thorny brush. Not a wall, not a fortress, just an impassable strip that an armed unit couldn't cross quickly. They left the ravine open. On the slopes, they dug positions for the archers, shallow ones, covered by branches, invisible from below. Daniel calculated the firing angles. From the left slope, they'd strike the head of the column. From the right, the rear. Crossfire. Nowhere to run. The system confirmed the calculations. A signal fire was set up at the top of the right hill, to be lit when the enemy enters the ravine. The signal for the first volley. They arrived at dawn, the 6th month, the beginning of summer. 3 signal fires on the watchtowers flared up during the night. A raid. Daniel hadn't slept. No one had slept. Heijin had deployed the archers to their positions the previous evening. 20 women, 10 on each slope. Soyeon was on the right, the farthest point, the most difficult angle. She'd volunteered herself. Heijin allowed it. The children and the elderly were in the cave behind the settlement. Miru was with them. Boran was with them. Daniel was in the rear, with the herbalist's bag, with bandages, with a decoction for pain. He is not a warrior. He has never been a warrior. His place is in the rear. The Cholpaltan entered the ravine at dawn. 63 men, armed, spears, axes, leather armor with iron plates. They marched noisily, confidently, as always, accustomed to the Talgyon offering no resistance, to women fleeing, to taking their spoils without a fight. They had passed halfway through the ravine when a bonfire flared up at the summit, a signal. The first volley from the left slope, 20 arrows, new bows, compound bows, powerful. The arrows struck the head of the column. Warriors fell. Screams, chaos. A second volley from the right slope, right at their heels. The Cholpaltan found themselves trapped. Arrows from the front, arrows from the rear. The ravine's walls were too steep to climb, nowhere to run. The battle lasted less than an hour. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Volley after volley. Heijin commanded from the left slope. Her voice was steady, steely. She didn't shout, she kept count. First line, second line, change of position, volley. The Cholpaltan tried to break through, twice. Both times, Soyeon, from the right slope, shot an arrow straight at the commander. Not to kill, into the shoulder, into the leg. The commander fell. The unit stopped. Without a commander, there is no breakthrough. Soyeon didn't kill. She stopped them. The accuracy came from her steady footing and calm hands. 40 minutes later, the Cholpaltan retreated. They ran. They abandoned the wounded. They abandoned their weapons. Heijin didn't pursue them. Daniel had asked her not to beforehand. Victory without a pursuit. Let them flee. Let them spread the word. Let them know that Talgyon is no longer a victim. Talgyon's casualties? 0. Not a single fatality. 3 wounded, a ricocheting arrow in the shoulder, a bruise from a rock, a dislocated wrist from drawing the bow. Daniel treated all 3 wounds within an hour. Clean bandages, a splint, a decoction for the pain. The system flashed. Mission accomplished. Protection through preparation. Reward credited. But Daniel wasn't looking at the panel. He was looking at Heijin. She was standing at the edge of the ravine, looking down. At the abandoned weapons. At the bloodstains on the rocks. At the arrows sticking out of the ground. Her arrows. The arrows of her archers. She turned to Daniel. For the first time, she called him by name. Not Kesaram, not the sleepy one. Da-il. 2 syllables. Quietly. Almost a whisper. Daniel heard her. He nodded. She nodded. That was enough. After the battle in the ravine, the world around Talgyon changed. The news spread through Sarangway like smoke in the wind. The women's tribe had defeated Cholpaltan without any casualties. It was impossible, but it had happened. And every clan within a 5-day journey asked itself the same question. How? The answer came quickly. A sorcerer, a fair-skinned stranger, the very one Cholpaltan had spoken of. He's not a sorcerer. He's worse. He does things. And the things he does change the rules. The refugees were the first to arrive. 3 women from a small clan to the north. Their village had been burned down by slave traders. They'd walked through the forest for 5 days without food. One was carrying a child, a boy, 2 years old. Daniel saw them when they emerged from the forest. The panel glowed red. Dehydration, exhaustion. The child had an infection. Mi Ryu took them in. She fed them, gave them water, treated their wounds. So-yeon helped. Her new skills as a healer came in handy. Daniel stood aside and watched. So-la went out to speak with the refugees herself. She asked who they were, where they were from, and why they had come.
The eldest of the three said they had heard about Taegyeon, about a tribe where children don't die in winter, about a tribe where the floors are warm and the water is clean. She said she wanted her son to live, just to live. Soleil was silent, then she nodded. Taegyeon gained 3 more members. The boy was the first man accepted into the tribe not as a captive, but as a child. After the first group, a second group arrived, then a third. In 3 months, 26 people came to Taegyeon. Women, children, 2 elderly people, 1 14-year-old boy from a friendly clan. His parents had sent him to learn. Word of Daniel's school had reached them as well. School. Daniel hadn't planned on starting a school. It just happened. Tae was to blame. She would tell the other children everything she learned from Daniel. The principles of the wheel, why water flows downhill, why smoke rises, how to count to 100, how to draw a straight line. The children listened. Then they would come to Daniel and ask questions. Then more came. Then Daniel found that every evening 15 children were sitting in front of him, and he was explaining to them how a lever works. He looked at the situation and thought he needed a classroom,
And a blackboard. And chalk. There was no chalk. There was charcoal. A flat rock at the edge of the settlement became the blackboard. A shelter they built in 2 days became the classroom. Taegyeon's school. Tae became the first student, officially. She read, she counted, she drew. She asked questions that sometimes left Daniel at a loss. She asked why the sky is blue. He explained light scattering. She asked what light is. He explained waves. She asked what a wave is. He drew a sine wave. She looked at it and said it looked like a snake. Then she asked if there were square waves. It took Daniel a second to realize that a 12-year-old girl from a primitive tribe had just asked a question about rectangular pulses. He laughed. For the first time in 6 months, he laughed for. Tae frowned and asked what was so funny. He said nothing, that she was smarter than he deserved. Tae thought for a moment and said that was true. The 7th month. Summer was in full swing. The garden beds had yielded a harvest. The first one. Small, but real. Turnips, millet, beans, onions.
Daniel stood over the garden beds, looking at the green rows, and his hands were trembling. Not from fatigue, from something else. He had planted it. These women had watered it. This soil had grown it. And now it was food. Food that wouldn't run off into the forest, wouldn't fly south, wouldn't spoil in 3 days. So-yeon was harvesting turnips and laughing. She always laughed when she was happy, loudly, infectiously. Tae ran between the garden beds and counted every root vegetable. She recorded them on birch bark. Taegyeon's first agricultural census. Ha-rim stood off to the side and wrote everything down. Every day she wrote. The chronicle grew. Daniel began making things that weren't necessary for survival, for the first time. Before that, everything he created had met only basic needs: warmth, food, water, shelter. Now he could afford something else: soap. The system provided the recipe: ash, fat, water. Boil, filter, boil again. Simple chemistry. Daniel made his first bar of soap in 3 days. Gray, shapeless, smelling of lye, but soap. He was the first to wash with it. Not out of vanity, out of the need to test it on himself. The whole tribe gathered to watch. 80 people stood and watched as the man lathered his hands with a gray lump and rinsed off the dirt with water. Dirt that wouldn't wash off with just water. It washed off with soap. So-yeon stood in the front row. When Daniel finished, she stepped closer. She sniffed his hands. She recoiled. Then she leaned in and sniffed again. Then she asked loudly in front of everyone, "Do all the people in the South really smell like this?" All the time. Daniel said yes. Something like that. So-yeon turned to the others and said that Southerners were crazy, but they smelled good. Everyone laughed. Even Hae-jin. Briefly. In a single breath. But she laughed. Then the sauna. Daniel spent 10 days building it. A stone sauna, with a steam room, with a hearth that heated the stones, with ventilation, with a separate room for washing, with wooden benches. The system provided a blueprint for a Russian bathhouse. Not a Korean one, a Russian one.
Daniel didn't know why it had to be Russian, but he suspected the system had a sense of humor. Or maybe it didn't, and a Russian bathhouse was simply the best fit for the local materials and climate. In any case, he built the bathhouse.
The women went in first, one at a time, in groups of 5. They came out red-faced, steamed up, dazed. Some went in and out 3 times in a row. Midiu sat in the steam room for an hour and came out looking as if she'd been reborn. Boran went in last, alone. She stayed inside for a long time. She came out quietly. Her eyes were red, not from the steam. She had been crying. Daniel didn't ask why. He knew. 10 years of living in someone else's body. 10 years of being afraid of her own muscles. And suddenly, hot water and steam and silence and no spasms. Just a body, her own, obedient, warm. Then Ta'i came in. Hejin's little sister ran up to Daniel and said he needed to go to the bathhouse too. He shook his head. He understood that it was taboo, a man entering a bathhouse used by women. He didn't want to break the rule. But then Sola came out of the main dwelling, the old chieftainess. She walked slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. She stopped in front of Daniel. The whole tribe was watching. Sola said that this man had warmed their children. He had warmed their old age. He had earned the right to be warm. And she herself led him to the bathhouse.
Daniel followed her, without looking back. It was quiet behind him. Then he heard a soft sound. Not crying, not laughter. Something in between. He didn't turn around, but he knew it was Hejin, and he knew that little Ta'i was standing next to her sister, holding her hand. He entered the bathhouse. He sat down on the hot bench. Steam hit his face. Hot, wet, real. He sat there and breathed, and for the first time in 7 months, he allowed himself to think that maybe, right here and now, this wasn't captivity. This was home. The 8th month, the end of summer. Taldion was unrecognizable. 112 people, 32 dwellings. The field had tripled in size. A second smokehouse, a second well. The sauna was in use every day. The mill ground grain from dawn on. The children attended school. The women, who had previously only hunted, now worked in the fields and in the workshops. Workshops. Daniel even stumbled over that word in his mind. The tribe now had workshops. A tannery, a pottery workshop, a weaving workshop. Simple, primitive, but functional. The system opened new sections of the catalog with every technique passed on. Every time Daniel taught someone, and that person taught the next, the reward tripled. A chain of knowledge. The system encouraged not a single master, but a network of masters. Harim became the center of this network. The quiet scribe from the kingdom of Heian found her place. She documented everything, every recipe, every technique, every blueprint. Daniel gave her paper. He set up production, 10 sheets a day, then 20. Harim wrote, neatly, clearly, in beautiful Heian script. She was creating Sarangwe's first technical library. She didn't know it, but Daniel did. In the evenings, they would sit together. He would dictate and she would write it down. A soap recipe, a drawing of an ondol, a diagram of a compound bow, the principle of a water wheel, smoking techniques. They worked in silence, intently. Sometimes Harim would ask a question, not about technology, but about words. She would ask what this or that in his language. Daniel spoke, in Korean, in English. Harim wrote down both versions. She was compiling a dictionary. Daniel didn't realize this right away. When he did, he looked at her with a new expression. She noticed and turned away. But the tips of her ears turned red. It was the first time he'd seen her blush. There was something between them. Not love, not attraction. Something else. 2 minds operating on the same wavelength. He spoke, and she understood not only the words, but also what lay between them. He drew a sketch, and she saw not lines, but a system. He explained a principle, and she was already formulating the consequences he hadn't yet voiced. It was like breathing in unison. Imperceptibly, naturally, frighteningly. One night they worked late. Daniel fell asleep right at the table. In the morning, he woke up to find that Harim had covered him with her shawl and left, and that there was another sheet of paper lying on the pillow. A poem, in Old Korean, about a man who thinks so loudly that you can hear him if you listen closely. Daniel read it, folded it, placed it next to the first poem. 2 sheets of paper, 2 poems, 2 moments when someone saw him, not what he was doing, him. The 9th month, fall, and with fall came bad news. Soyeon returned from a long reconnaissance mission, looking pale. She had seen strangers, not the Cholpoltan, others, organized, in identical armor, with flags. Soldiers, real soldiers, not clan warriors, but a regular army. They were marching along the southern trail, 20 men. At their head was a man in fine armor with a sword at his belt. Soyeon didn't get close, but she heard a name. Park. Captain Park. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. The kingdom of Haeon. Captain Park Junho. The very one Harim had told her about. She knew him, not personally, by reputation. A military man, a careerist. Tough, but not senselessly cruel. He had been sent to Sarangway on an official mission, a trade expedition. In reality, he was searching for a foreigner, a fair-skinned man in the wildlands. The rumor had reached the capital of Haeon, and someone at court decided that this stranger was worth sending 20 soldiers after. Harim turned pale when she heard it. Daniel saw it. A panel lit up above her. Fear. Sharp, deep. She had fled Haeon 3 years ago. Daniel didn't know the details. She hadn't told him. But now her hands were shaking so much that an ember fell onto the birch bark and burned a hole through it. Daniel sat down beside her. He said quietly that no one would send her back. Harim looked at him. In her eyes was not gratitude. A question. How can you promise that? Daniel couldn't, but he said it anyway, because sometimes words are needed not for the truth, but for support. Hae-jin reacted instantly. She stepped up patrols. She sent out scouts to monitor Park Chun-ho's unit. The soldiers moved slowly, cautiously. They didn't know the terrain. There were no maps of Sarangway. They were wandering aimlessly. They questioned small clans. Some pointed north. Some remained silent. They had time, but not much. And at the same time, a second shadow appeared. Sam Walker, gray-haired. Harim was the first to notice the mark. She had seen such marks before, in Haeon, at the slave markets. A small notch in a tree, the shape of a sickle, the mark of a slave trader. Someone from Walker's men had passed through Talgyeon territory recently, a scout. That meant Walker knew where they were. That meant he was coming. Harim told Daniel about Sodom Walker, a half-breed, English on his father's side, 20 years in the slave trade, smart, calculating, patient. He doesn't attack, he waits. He finds a weak spot, strikes once, precisely, and disappears with the merchandise. The merchandise is people. He regarded people as merchandise just as naturally as Daniel regarded stones as raw material. No malice, no sadism, just business. That made him more terrifying than any fanatic with an axe. Daniel understood. 2 enemies at once. Captain Park Jun-ho, who's looking for him, and Sam Walker, who was looking for the merchandise. Talgyeon was caught between them. He'd grown up, he'd grown stronger, but he was still small. 112 people against a world that considered them savages or prey. Daniel sat by the cold hearth at night and thought. The system was silent. It didn't provide answers to questions like that. How to protect people from those who don't see them as human. It wasn't an engineering problem. It was a human one. In the morning, he went to see Sola. He said he needed to talk about the future. Not tomorrow, about the future. The old woman looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. The two of them sat together in her dwelling. Daniel spoke. Talgyeon could not remain a single tribe against everyone else. They needed allies. They needed trade. They needed strength that could not be obtained alone. He used a word that Sola did not know. Confederation, he explained. Several tribes, equal, independent, but bound by a treaty, mutual defense, shared trade, exchange of knowledge. Each tribe remains itself, but together they are greater than the sum of their parts. Soleil listened. She was silent. Then she said that Daniel thought like a chieftain. He replied that he thought like an engineer, that the system was stronger than any single element. Soleil smiled. For the first time in his presence, a subtle, weary, wise smile. She said that an engineer and a chieftain were one and the same, just on different scales. The 10th month. Fall was turning into winter. Daniel's second winter in Sarangway. His first without a collar. His first in which he faced the cold not with dread, but with readiness. Meat supplies were stocked. Grain was threshed. Firewood was gathered. The walls were insulated. The wells were working. The bathhouse was heated. School was in session every day. Talgyeon was more prepared for winter than it had ever been in its history. But Daniel wasn't thinking about winter. He was thinking about the cave. Soleil had told him about it a month ago. Talgyeon's sacred cave, a 2-hour walk north of the settlement. The tribe's relics were kept there. The most important rituals were held there. There lay the diary of Talgyeon's first female chieftain, Hanil, written in an ancient language that no one in the tribe could read anymore. No one had been able to read it for 200 years. Soleil mentioned it in passing. As a matter of fact, as something that had long since lost its significance. But Daniel was hooked. The ancient language, Old Korean, the very same one his grandmother had spoken, the very same one the system had recognized on the first day, the very same one he could read. He asked Boran, not Soleil, not Heijin, Boran, because the cave was sacred, and what was sacred belonged to the priestess. Boran listened. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that the cave was off limits to men. It always had been. It was the law. Daniel said he understood, and that he wasn't asking to go inside. He was asking her to bring him the diary, or read it aloud, or at least describe what was written in it. Boran asked why. Daniel said he could read it, that the language of the diary was his grandmother's language, that he was the only person in Sarangway who could read those words.
Boran looked at him for a long time. Her ashen eyes were expressionless. Then she said she would bring it. She brought it 3 days later, at night, quietly. She placed a bundle of oiled leather in front of him. Inside lay a stack of birch bark sheets, thin, darkened by time, and covered in fine handwriting, Old Korean. Daniel picked up the first sheet. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. He began to read, slowly, with difficulty. Some of the characters were unfamiliar, variants he hadn't even seen in his grandmother's books. But the roots were the same, and the system helped. It highlighted the unfamiliar symbols. It offered possible meanings. Daniel read all night. The Diary of Talgyon Hanil, the first female chieftain, the founder of the women's law, 200 years ago. She wrote in even, calm handwriting, without emotion, like a report. The war with the Kyunga clan. The men of Talgyon fought. The Talgyon men were defeated. The survivors returned, 23 out of 100. They proposed peace, the terms of peace, to hand over all girls under the age of 12 to the Kimga clan in exchange for the safety of the rest. The men agreed. Hanil did not agree. She wrote this plainly. I will not give up my daughters, not a single one, not at any price. Daniel read on. Hanil gathered the women, at night, in secret. She told them that the men had decided to give up their daughters. The women decided that the men would not give them up. Hanil prepared a decoction, an herbal one, from a root that Mirio knew, deadly in a certain dosage. She added it to their drink. In the morning, at breakfast, 23 men, all 23, seated at a single table, not a single one stood up. Hanil wrote, I killed them, with my own hands, by my own decision. They wanted to sell our daughters. I wouldn't let that happen, and so I created a story. The men betrayed us and sold us to slave traders. A lie, a necessary lie, because the truth would kill the tribe faster than poison. Daniel stopped. He set the sheet of paper aside. His hands were shaking. He sat in silence, listening to his pulse. 200 years. For 200 years, Talgyon had lived a lie. Men as traitors, men as enemies. Every girl grew up with this story. Heijin grew up with this story. Hatred of men, fear of men, distrust of men. All of this stemmed from the lie of a woman who made a terrible choice for the sake of her daughters. Was it the right choice? Daniel didn't know. It wasn't for him to judge, but a lie. 200 years of lies, and he was the only one who knew the truth. He read on. The last pages of the diary. Hanil had written about a vision, before the war, long before the poisoning. She had seen a man, fair-skinned, speaking an ancient language, coming from the north. He would restore men to their rightful place alongside women, neither above nor below, beside them. She had been waiting for him, her whole life. He didn't come, and out of grief and fear, she did what she did. And the last line of the diary. If you're reading this, it means you've come. Too late, but you've come. I'm sorry I didn't wait for you. Daniel closed the diary. He set it on the table. He stepped outside. The night air hit his face. Cold, clear. The stars shone so brightly it seemed he could reach out and touch them. He stood there, breathing and remembering. Furu, the stroller. The moment when he pushed it and didn't make it in time. A split second. A woman's voice in Old Korean. You're 200 years late. But better late than never. The same voice, the same one from the diary, Hanil. She had been calling him 200 years, and he had come. Too late for her, but just in time for the others. Maybe. He didn't know. He stood under the stars and didn't know. Boran found him in the morning. She asked what was in the diary. Daniel was silent. for a long time. Then he told the truth, the whole truth, without embellishment. Boran listened. Her face didn't flinch. She was a priestess. She knew how to listen to terrible things without showing fear. When he finished, she asked what he was going to do. Would he tell the council? Would he tell the tribe? Daniel said he didn't know, that this was the hardest choice of his life. Telling the truth meant destroying the very foundation on which Talgyan stood. 200 years of history, 200 years of identity. We are the ones betrayed by men. We are the ones who survived in spite of it all. To remove it would be to pull the rug out from under them. But to hide the truth meant to perpetuate the lie. It meant allowing hatred to live on. It meant allowing He-Jin to hate men for a crime they did not commit. Boran was silent. Then she said one thing. She said that Hanyo had been protecting her daughters, and that the lie had been a shield. But a shield that you've carried for 200 years grows into your skin, and taking it off hurts. But not taking it off means suffocating. Daniel made up his mind. Not right away, not that day. He thought about it for a week. He walked around, he worked, he remained silent. Then he went to see Sola, alone, without Boran. He told her everything. The old woman listened. The jade disc in her hands trembled. When he finished, she closed her eyes. She sat there for a long time. Then she opened her eyes and said she knew. Not everything, but she had guessed. That there was poison, that there was a lie, that her grandmother had told this story too smoothly, like a memorized text, not like a memory. She said that Daniel had to tell the council, the whole council, that the truth belonged neither to him nor to her. The truth belonged to Talyung. The council met that evening, 5 women and Daniel. He spoke quietly, calmly, without emotion, as if reading from a diary. Facts. Only facts. Medio listened and nodded. She wasn't surprised. She had always suspected it. Harem took notes. Her hands didn't tremble. She's a scribe. She records the truth. Any truth. Boran remained silent. She already knew. And He-Jin sat and listened. And Daniel looked at her and saw something breaking. Not anger, not rage. Something deeper. The foundation, the bedrock upon which she had built her entire life. Men had betrayed her. Men cannot be trusted. Men are enemies. And yet, men hadn't betrayed her. A woman had killed, to save her daughters, right or wrong, but not men. He-Jin stood up. She walked out in silence. No one stopped her. Daniel wanted to go after her. Soleil put her hand on his shoulder. She shook her head. Not now. She needs time. Daniel stayed. Ha-Jin didn't come back for 2 days. Ta'i cried. She begged Daniel to find her sister. Daniel said He-Jin would come back, that she needed to be alone for a while. Ta'i asked how he knew. Daniel said he didn't know, but he believed it. Ta'i looked at him. Then she nodded. She believed it too. On the 3rd day, He-Jin returned, silently. Her face was ashen. Her eyes were empty. She walked through the settlement and stopped in front of Daniel. She looked him in the eyes for a long time. Then she said she hated him. She'd hated him for 8 months, because he was a man, because men had betrayed her. But now, men hadn't betrayed her, and she doesn't know who to hate, and she doesn't know who she is without hatred. Daniel replied. He said that she was He-Jin, a warrior who protects her tribe, a sister who bears a scar and isn't ashamed of it, a woman who doesn't need hatred to be strong. He-Jin listened. Then she turned and walked away, but her back was straight, not tense, just straight. That was the difference. The truth about Hanil split the tribe, not in half, worse, into dozens of tiny cracks. Every woman heard the story, and each reacted in her own way. The elders remained silent. They had lived their lives on a foundation that turned out to be a lie, and silence was the only thing they could afford while the ground shook beneath their feet. The young women were angry, not at Hanil, at the lie, at 200 years of lies, at the fact that they had been taught to hate men for a crime that never happened. Some were angry at Daenil, for what he had read, for what he had told them, for destroying a world that, though cruel, had been understandable. Boran took the brunt of it, like a priestess, like a guardian of the spiritual. She spoke with each woman individually, quietly, patiently, in her own whisper. She said that Hanil hadn't betrayed the tribe. She had saved the daughters, that the lie had been a shield, that the shield was no longer needed, that the truth was more painful but easier to bear. Some listened. Some walked away before she finished. Daniel kept his distance. This wasn't his place, not his pain, not his right to heal. He had built the ondol, dug the well, and made the bows. But this was different.
It was a wound that couldn't be covered with a bandage or warmed by a heated floor. He worked, in silence, every day. He repaired the fence around the field. He built a new shed for the school. He sharpened millstones. He did what he knew how to do, with his hands. Soyeon came to help. She was the only one among the young people who wasn't angry. She told Daniel that the truth is the truth, that it's foolish to be angry at the truth, that you should be angry at lies. And even better, don't be angry, just act. She said it with such simplicity that for a second, Daniel saw in her not a 19-year-old girl, but someone much older. Or maybe you shouldn't underestimate 19-year-olds. A week had passed. The cracks began to heal. Not because someone had said the right words, because life went on. The children got sick and were treated. Food ran out, and they went out to find more. Snow fell, and they shoveled it away. Life didn't wait for the tribe to get through the crisis. Life went on and dragged people along with it. Mireyo put it best. She said that grief is a luxury Taegyeon cannot afford for more than a week. 10 days after the revelation, Soleil gathered the tribe, everyone, 112 people, at the sacred stone. She stood there, small and thin, with a jade disc around her neck, and she spoke. She said that Hanil had killed the men, that it was true, that the truth was terrifying, but that Hanil had done it for the sake of her daughters, and that every woman standing there now was alive because 200 years ago, one mother had decided that daughters were more important than husbands. She said that the lies were over, that from this day forward, the history of Taegyeon would be real, painful, complicated, but real. She said that men were not enemies, nor were they friends. They were people, just like women, capable of betrayal and sacrifice, to cowardice and to heroism, and that they know one such person personally. She looked at Daniel. She didn't point at him, she just looked. Everyone understood. Ha-jin stood in the back row. Ta-yi was beside her, holding her sister's hand. Ha-jin listened to Soleil, her face impassive, but the hand holding Ta-yi's was clenching tighter and tighter. Ta-yi Tunes endured it. She didn't complain. After Soleil's speech, Ha-jin approached Daniel. She stood in front of him. She said she still didn't trust men, that one person wasn't enough to erase 20 years of hatred, but that one person was enough to make her start to doubt, and that this doubt was more than she had been willing to give anyone a year ago. Daniel nodded. Doubt. He'll take that. He could work with that. The 11th month brought the first snow of the second winter, and along with the snow came the envoys. Not from Cholpaltan, from 2 other clans, small ones, peaceful ones, the Chonsu clan and the Moran clan. They came with a proposal, trade. They had heard of Taegyeon soap, of smoked meat, flour, paper. They wanted to trade hides and iron ore for goods that couldn't be found anywhere else in Sarangway. Daniel listened, and something ignited inside him. Iron ore. Iron. Until now, he'd had no metal, only stone, wood, and bone. With iron, everything changed. Tools, nails, hinges, knives, a plow, a real plow instead of a digging stick. The system flashed. The catalog was updated. Basic metallurgy, a blast furnace, bellows, an anvil, forging. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He opened them. The world had grown wider. Soleil received the envoys. A trade agreement was concluded in a single evening. Talgon's first trade agreement in history. Harim wrote it down on paper, 3 copies. Each clan received one. This too was a first, a written agreement. Before, everything was settled verbally. Words are forgotten. Paper isn't. Daniel watched as Harim write and thought she didn't even realize what she was doing. She was creating law, written law, the foundation of civilization, with a single pen, with a single sheet of paper. But news also arrived with the envoys. Bad news. Captain Park Jung-ho had set up camp 3 days' journey to the south. He had found a winter encampment and was waiting for spring. His soldiers were questioning everyone they met. A fair-skinned man. Where? The Mordan clan lied to him. They pointed west. But lies don't last forever. In the spring, Park will set out again. And secondly, Walker. Gray-haired Walker has assembled a detachment. 30 men. Mercenaries, former soldiers, bandits, professionals. He was heading north, slowly, like a hunter who knows where his prey is and is in no hurry. The envoys said they'd seen his men, that one of them had a boy on a leash, about 8 years old, skinny, with empty eyes. Merchandise. Daniel listened and felt something rising from within. Not fear, not anger, a cold clarity, like the system panel, only sharper. He went to Heijin. He said Walker was coming, that he had 30 fighters, that this wasn't Cholpaltan, not clans that run at the first volley, professionals. Heijin listened. She asked when. Daniel said by the end of winter, maybe sooner. Heijin nodded. She began to prepare. She doubled her training sessions. She stepped up patrols. She sent scouts south. Daniel began to think, not about bows and arrows, about something else. The ravine had worked once. It wouldn't work a second time. Walker was smarter. Walker wouldn't walk into a trap. He needed something else. The system was silent. It didn't provide combat solutions, but it did provide engineering ones, and the line between defense and offense sometimes depended on intent. Daniel sat down and began to sketch. The 12th month, midwinter. Daniel was working with iron, the first iron in Taljaon's history. The ore had been brought from the Chonsu clan in exchange for 20 bars of soap and 10 sheets of paper. Paper was valued as highly as silver. No clan in Sarangway had paper. Taljaon was the sole supplier. And Daniel understood that this was only the beginning. He built the blast furnace in 5 days, made of stone, with a clay lining, goatskin bellows. The system guided every step: temperature, time, proportions. Daniel wasn't a blacksmith. He was an engineer who understood the principles. The difference between a blacksmith and an engineer is that a blacksmith feels the metal with his hands, while an engineer calculates it with his head. Daniel calculated. The first smelting attempt failed. The temperature was too low. The ore didn't melt completely. The second attempt was better. The third yielded the first piece of iron, rough, with impurities, but iron nonetheless. Daniel picked it up with tongs and placed it on the stone anvil. He struck it. The metal rang out. The sound carried through the settlement, and the women looked up. They had never heard that sound before. The sound of a hammer striking iron. A sound that changed the world. Their world, too. The first things Daniel made from iron were not weapons. They were tools. A knife. A real one. Sharp. Not made of stone or bone, but of iron. He gave it to Midiu for surgery. The herbalist took the knife and ran her finger along the blade. She cut herself. She looked at the blood, then at the knife, then at Daniel. She said that before, she used to cut open abscesses with a bone scalpel, and half the patients developed infections from bone fragments in the wound. That won't happen now. Then nails. Small ones, crooked ones, but nails nonetheless. With nails, you could build differently, not tie poles together with ropes, hammer them together, securely, forever. Then door hinges, then hooks, then hoe heads. With iron hoes, the field could be expanded threefold, fourfold, fivefold. Every iron object changed life. Not dramatically, quietly, like an ondol on the first winter night. It just suddenly became easier. Daniel taught 2 women to forge, strong women, with strong hands. One of them was a former hunter named Kyung-hee. She was quiet and broad-shouldered and had given up hunting after a bear broke 3 fingers on her left hand. The fingers had healed, but she could no longer draw a bow. A blacksmith's hammer didn't require 3 fingers. It required strength and precision. Kyung-hee had both. A week later, she was forging nails without Daniel's help. 2 weeks later, she was making knives. Rough, but functional. The system awarded her triple the points. Skill transfer. Multiplier. The catalog exploded with new sections. Glass. Daniel read it and paused. Glass. Sand and soda and limestone and high temperatures. Everything was there. Everything was available. Glass. He began melting glass in the 3rd week of the 12th month. The furnace had to be rebuilt. A higher temperature was needed. More bellows. More coal. Daniel worked and Kyung-hee helped. On the 4th day, they produced their first piece of glass. Cloudy, greenish, with bubbles, but transparent. Daniel picked up the piece and held it up to the light. The sun shone through the green glass and cast a colored speck of light on the wall. Thais squealed with delight. Midiu came over and took the piece of glass. She looked through it. Her hands were trembling. She said what she saw, that she could see small letters on the birch bark that had previously been a cloudy smudge. She was 42 years old, and for the past 5 years, she had been treating people while half blind. She didn't speak. She endured, just as Heijin endured her shoulder brace, just as So-yeon endured her limp. The women of Talgyun knew how to endure. It was both their strength and their curse. Daniel made Midiu a lens. Not glasses, a lens. A polished piece of glass in a wooden frame, a magnifying glass. She looked through it at her hand and saw every wrinkle, every line, every hair. Then she looked at the stars, through the magnifying glass, and she cried, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Daniel stood beside her, saying nothing. Midu said she could see the stars, that before they had been white dots, but now they were alive. Daniel didn't reply. Some moments shouldn't be spoiled by words. Meanwhile, He-Jin was preparing the defenses, rigorously, methodically. 20 archers trained every day, new arrows with iron tips, heavier, more accurate, more powerful. Daniel made a crossbow, one, for hunting large game. The system allowed it, hunting, not war. But the crossbow could pierce a wooden shield from 30 paces away. He-Jin put it to the test. She fired. The bolt passed through a log as thick as her palm. She looked at the crossbow, then at Daniel. She said nothing, but she took the crossbow. Scouts had reported Walker was 2 days' march away. 30 men, well armed, iron weapons, steel arrowheads. The 3 leaders wore chainmail. These weren't clan warriors with axes. These were professionals. Daniel hadn't slept for 3 nights. He'd been sketching, calculating, thinking. The ravine won't work. Walker will send out scouts. They'll spot the ambush. They'll go around it. We need something else. Daniel looked at the map Ha-Rim had drawn. Accurate, detailed, with every trail, every hill, every stream. And he saw it. A stream. That very one. The one with the mill on it. It flows from north to south, through a narrow valley, the only convenient route to Talgyeon from the south. Walker will take it, because in winter the snow is deep, but the path along the stream is well-trodden, convenient, fast, predictable. Daniel looked at the mill, at the dam he'd built to regulate the flow. Small, wooden, holding back a pond the size of 2 dwellings, and he realized he wouldn't build a weapon, he would build a dam, a big one, further upstream. Wood, stone, and clay. The system had no objection. A dam is an engineering structure, not a weapon. The fact that the water accumulated behind the dam could wash away a squad in a narrow valley was a side effect, an engineering one. Daniel began to build. He-Jin watched. She understood right away. She didn't ask any questions. She simply sent 10 women to help. It took 5 days to build the dam, day and night, in the cold and snow. Their hands went numb, their backs ached, but they kept building. Tai-Yi brought the sketch Daniel had drawn and stared at it for a long time. Then she asked what would happen when the water receded. Daniel replied that there would be mud, lots of mud. Tai-Yi thought for a moment and said that mud was better than blood. 12 years old. She said that when she was 12. Walker arrived at dawn, the 13th month, the end of winter. Snow still lay on the ground, but the sun was already warm. 3 bonfires flared up on the watchtowers, one after another. A raid. Daniel hadn't slept. He was waiting by the dam. Ha-Jin had stationed archers along the slopes of the valley, not to shoot, to keep watch, to make sure Walker went where he was supposed to, along the stream, across the valley, past the dam. The scouts reported, 31 people. They're following the stream bed, just as Daniel predicted. At the head was a man in a dark cloak, gray hair, a calm face. Walker. Behind him were mercenaries, and in the middle of the column were 4 bound prisoners, 2 women, a man, and a boy. That very same one, about 8 years old, skinny, with a rope around his neck. The merchandise Walker was carrying with him, to sell or to trade. Daniel looked down at the boy from above, from the dam. The distance was great, but the system illuminated the scene. Min-Soo, 8 years old, exhaustion, dehydration, multiple bruises, fear, deep traumatic fear. Daniel clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached. The plan was simple. Wait until Walker entered the narrowest part of the valley. Open the dam gate. The water would do the rest. A simple plan. Clean. Engineering. No blood on Talgin's hands. Water and gravity. Physics. Daniel stood by the gate and waited. Walker was coming. Slowly. Cautiously. He sent scouts ahead. 2 of them. They passed through the narrow section and didn't notice anything, because there was nothing to notice. No traps. No ambushes. Just a dam 200 paces up the slope, hidden by the trees. Walker entered the narrow section. His men followed him, the bound prisoners in the middle, the boy. Daniel looked at the boy and realized he couldn't do it. He couldn't open the sluice gate. The water would sweep everyone away, the mercenaries, the prisoners, and the boy, an 8-year-old boy with a rope around his neck.
Physics doesn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Water doesn't choose. He stood by the sluice gate and his hand wouldn't move. A second. 2. 3. He-jin was on the left slope. She saw that he was hesitating. She didn't know why. Then she saw them. The prisoners. The boy. And she understood. Daniel stepped away from the gate. He'd made up his mind. A different plan. Worse. More dangerous. But without the boy in the current. He signaled He-jin. 2 whistles, not 3. 2 meant wait. He-jin froze. She waited. Daniel ran down the slope, toward the valley, toward Walker, alone, unarmed. The system was silent. It neither approved nor forbade it. It was his choice, not an engineering one, a human one. He stepped onto the trail in front of Walker, alone, hands in plain sight, empty. Walker stopped. He raised his hand. His men stopped behind him. Walker looked at Daniel, calmly, appraisingly, like a buyer looking at merchandise. He said in Heian with a strong accent that he was glad to finally meet him, that he'd heard a lot about him, that a fair-skinned foreigner was worth a lot of money in the South, that certain collectors would pay as much as a village was worth, maybe 2. Daniel replied in Heian. His Heian was worse than his Talgyan, but good enough. He said he wasn't merchandise. Walker smiled. He said everyone said that. Then they stopped. Daniel said he wanted to propose a deal. Walker listened. Daniel said he'd let him go, alive, with his people, if Walker handed over the captives, all 4 of them, and left, and never come back. Walker laughed, quietly, without malice, like an adult laughing at a child who offers to trade a pebble for a horse. He asked why he should agree. Daniel pointed to the slopes. Walker looked. He saw nothing. The archers were hidden. But Daniel said that 20 arrows were aimed at him right now, that his men were in a narrow valley, that there was nowhere to go, and that above them was a dam full of water. 1 word, and the water would wash everything away. Walker stopped smiling. He looked up. He saw the edge of the dam through the trees. He did the math in his head. He was smart. He understood. A narrow valley, water from above, arrows from the sides. A trap. He'd walked into a trap. For the first time in 20 years of the slave trade, he said Daniel was bluffing, that if he opened the dam, he'd kill the captives too. Daniel replied that yes, he would, that he would kill them, and that was exactly why he was standing there, down below, in the valley, beneath the dam, next to the captives, that if the water came, it would sweep him away too, and that he was ready. Silence. Walker looked at Daniel. For the first time during their long conversation, something resembling confusion appeared in his eyes. Not fear. Slave traders aren't afraid of death. They're afraid of losses. Incomprehension. He couldn't understand a man who was willing to die for someone else's captives. It didn't fit into his frame of reference. In his world, people were commodities. Commodities don't die for other commodities, Walker thought, for a long time. His mercenaries were getting nervous. They saw the slopes. They saw the dam. They were doing the math. 31 against 20 archers, plus water from above, plus a narrow valley. The math wasn't in their favor. One of the mercenaries said something to Walker, quietly. Walker waved him off. Then another spoke louder. Walker turned and slapped him across the face. Silence. He turned back to Daniel. He proposed something else. The prisoners in exchange for Daniel. A trade. 1 foreigner was worth more than 2 women, an old man, and a boy. A good deal. Daniel was silent. He was thinking. On the hillside, He-jin gripped her crossbow so tightly her knuckles turned white. She saw it. She heard it. The wind carried the words upward. She realized he was about to agree. And for the first time in her life, Yoon He-jin was afraid. Not for herself. For him. Daniel opened his mouth to reply, and at that moment, an arrow struck Walker in the shoulder. From above, from the left slope. He-jin. She had fired without orders, without a signal, because she couldn't let him say yes. Walker fell to one knee. His men surged forward. He-jin shouted. The first volley. 20 arrows rained down on the valley. Mercenaries were falling. Screams. Chaos. Daniel rushed toward the captives. He grabbed the boy. He ripped the rope from around his neck. He lifted him into his arms. He ran up the slope. So-yeon was shooting from above, providing cover. Every arrow was precise. Every one hit its mark. Not to kill, to stop. A shoulder, a leg, an arm. So-yeon wasn't killing them. She was stopping them. The mercenaries ran. Back, down the stream, away. 10, 15, 20. They ran, throwing down their weapons. Walker stayed behind. He was kneeling with an arrow in his shoulder. He looked up. At Hae-jin, who was coming down the slope with a crossbow in her hands. She approached him, close. He looked at her, said calmly that he was offering a good price for the foreigner. Hae-jin looked down at him. Then she fired. The crossbow bolt pierced his chest. Walker fell, quietly, without a scream. His last words were about the price. He died a merchant, right to the very end. Daniel sat on the hillside. The boy was in his arms. Min-soo, 8 years old, skinny, dirty, with a scraped neck, with empty eyes that were slowly filling with something. Not tears, something else. The realization that the rope was gone, that the arms holding him were warm, that no one was hitting him. The boy clung to Daniel's jacket and wouldn't let go. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, he just held on. Daniel pulled him close and sat there. Hae-jin approached. She looked at them, at the boy, at Daniel. She didn't say a word. She just stood there beside them, with a crossbow in her hands, with Walker's blood on the bolt. And she stood there, like a wall between them and the world. After Walker's death, a week of silence passed. The Taljin buried not their own dead, but strangers, Daniel insisted. The mercenaries who had died in the valley were people. Bad people, but people. They were buried at the edge of the forest without honors, but with dignity. Hae-jin didn't argue. A month ago, she would have argued. Not now. Min-soo didn't speak. 3 days. 5. A week. He sat in the corner of the dwelling and stared at the wall. He ate only if Daniel was sitting next to him. He slept only if Daniel was in the same room. The panel was lit. Acute trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Restricted speech. Daniel didn't treat him. He didn't pressure him. He didn't force him to talk. He just stayed by his side. He worked, he ate, he slept. And Min-soo slowly got used to the fact that there was a person nearby who wouldn't leave or hit him. Tae was the first to help. She sat down next to Min-soo and began to draw, silently, with charcoal on birch bark. A house, a tree, the sun, childish drawings. Min-soo watched. On the second day, he picked up a piece of charcoal. On the third, he drew something, small, crooked, a hand, someone's hand. Tae looked at the drawing and didn't ask whose hand it was. She simply drew another hand next to it, a bigger one, holding the first one. Min-soo looked at it and his lips twitched. Not a smile, but a tremor that would one day become a smile. On the 10th day, Min-soo said his first word. Not a name, not a request, a question. He asked Daniel if he could stay. Daniel replied that yes, he could, that he could stay as long as he wanted. Min-soo nodded. Then he took Daniel's hand and didn't let go until evening. From that day on, he followed Daniel around like Biju, like Tae, another child, another shadow. Daniel didn't object. He didn't consider himself a father, but Min-soo decided for him. Spring, the 2nd year, Captain Park Jun-ho. He found Taegyeon. Not on his own. He was tipped off. One of Walker's fleeing mercenaries had made it to his camp and told him. A fair-skinned foreigner, a tribe of women, in the north, dams and meadows and walls. Park set out immediately. 20 soldiers, the regular army of the Kingdom of Heian. Discipline, weapons, armor. Not mercenaries, professionals on a whole other level. They appeared on the 3rd day of spring, without warning. They emerged from the forest and stood before the settlement. In formation, organized. Park Jun-ho at the front, short, lean, a face as if carved from stone. His eyes were watchful. He wasn't like Walker. Walker was a predator. Park was a soldier. The difference was enormous. A predator attacks for prey. A soldier follows orders. A predator can be tricked. A soldier can only be persuaded. Ha-jin led out the archers. 20 women on the walls, arrows nocked, a crossbow in her hands. Pak looked at the walls, at the archers, at the crossbow, at the settlement beyond the walls, the mill, the blacksmith shop, the bathhouse, the school, the field. He saw all of this, and Daniel saw his expression change. Not fear, surprise. He had expected to find savages living in pits. He found a settlement that looked better than some of the small towns in Heian itself. Daniel came out to meet him, alone, unarmed. just as he had with Walker, but differently, not with desperation, with confidence. He stood on his own land, among his people. Behind him were the walls he had built. Park looked at him. He said he was looking for a stranger, that the crown of Heian wanted to know who he was and where he came from. Daniel replied that he was Sodail, that he came from nowhere, that he was here. Park said he had orders to bring the stranger to the capital, alive. Daniel asked what would happen in the capital. Park answered honestly. Interrogation, investigation, possibly captivity, possibly service at court. It depends on what the crown decides. Daniel said he wouldn't go, that his place was here. Park said it wasn't a request. Daniel said he knew. Silence. 20 soldiers against 20 archers. Daniel between them. Pat. Park thought. He was a soldier, but not a fool. 20 archers in fortified positions with compound bows, plus a crossbow, plus the walls. He'd lose men, many, maybe all of them. For the sake of a single prisoner, was it worth it? He looked at Daniel, then at the settlement, then back at Daniel, and asked a question Daniel hadn't expected. He asked what Daniel had done with the walls. What kind of mortar? What kind of masonry? Why the stones fit together so perfectly? Daniel blinked. Then he answered. Lime mortar, alternating large and small stones, drainage at the base. Pak listened. He nodded. He asked about the mill, about the dam, about the iron. Every question was technical, specific, professional. Pak Junho was a military engineer, not just a soldier, an engineer. He looked at Taljun and saw not savages, but solutions, technology, a system. The conversation lasted 3 hours, standing between the two armies. Daniel spoke about Taljun, about what he had done, about what he was going to do, about the Confederation, about trade, about how Sarong we shouldn't be a land of slaves and savages, that people could live here, free, educated, strong. Pak listened. His face remained unchanged, but his eyes changed. Something in them was melting, like snow in the spring sun, slowly but unstoppably. When Daniel finished, Pak was silent for a long time. Then he said he hated the slave trade, that for 20 years he had served a crown that turned a blind eye to people being sold like cattle, that he had been sent here not for a foreigner, but for silence. He had been sent far from the capital because he asked uncomfortable questions. He said he had orders, and that for the first time in his life, he was going to disobey them. Park Jun-ho didn't take Daniel away. He stayed. With his soldiers, 20 professional soldiers, with iron weapons and iron discipline. He said he would report to the crown that he hadn't found the foreigner, that the tracks led west, that the expedition had failed. A lie, but a lie that would buy Taljun time. A year, maybe 2, until the crown sends a new expedition. By then, Taljun should be strong enough that it won't matter. Heijin lowered her crossbow. She looked at Park. She looked at Daniel. She said that if this soldier betrayed them, she would personally track him down to the ends of the earth. Park looked at her, at the scar, at the crossbow, at her eyes. He said he believed her. And that was exactly why he was staying. Ha-Rim stepped out from behind the wall. She saw Park. She turned pale. He saw her. He recognized her. Not her personally, the uniform of a court scribe, the handwriting on the trade agreement the Chongsu envoys had shown him. He said he'd heard about a female scribe who'd fled the capital. Ha-Rim flinched. Park said he wasn't looking for her, that no one was, that the court had forgotten her the very day she disappeared, that she was free. Ha-Rim stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks, quietly. For 3 years, she had lived in fear that they would come for her. 3 years. And now that fear was gone, like a collar from Daniel's neck. A click, and she was free. Spring of the 2nd year, the square in front of the sacred stone, the very same one where, a year ago, Daniel had stood in a collar, waiting the council's decision. Now the square was different, wider, paved with stone. Torches stood on poles along the edges. A large fire burned in the center, not for warmth, for light, so that everyone could see one another. There were many people, 140 residents of Taljun, a delegation from the Chonsu clan, 12 people, a delegation from the Moran clan, 9, a delegation from the Gyeongga clan, the very same clan they had fought 200 years ago, 7 people. They had come because Taljun's soap, paper, and iron tools proved more valuable than old grudges. 20 of Park Jin-ho's soldiers in new uniforms without the Heian insignia. Walkers rescued slaves who had remained in Taljun, 11 people. The boy, Min Su. He stood next to Daniel. He held his hand. He wasn't hiding. He just stood there. Sala stepped out onto the square, slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. She had aged over the past year. Or perhaps she had simply stopped pretending she wasn't old. The jade disc around her neck glowed green in the light of the torches. She stopped in front of everyone. She paused. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but the square was designed so that the sound traveled from stone to stone, and everyone heard every word. Daniel knew why. He had designed the acoustics. The semicircular wall behind the speaker reflected the sound forward. Simple physics, which was now working in favor of words that were anything but simple. Soleil was speaking about Talgon, about 200 years, about pain and strength and lies and truth, about women who survived not because they were right, but because they were resilient, about men who were hated for a crime they didn't commit, about a female leader who poisoned her husbands for the sake of her daughters and created a world built on fear, about how fear is no longer necessary. She spoke, and the square was silent. 200 people were silent. Daniel stood in the third row, between Miru and Soyan. Minsu pressed himself against his side. Ta-yi stood up front, next to her sister. Heijin stood upright, her face impassive, her hands at her sides. But Ta-yi was holding her little finger, a small, secret gesture. No one saw it. Daniel saw it. Sola finished speaking about the past. She began to speak about the future, about the Confederation, a word Daniel had told her 4 months ago. She pronounced it in Talgion. She reworked it, adapted it. The word sounded like Hanamudi, one, many, the unity of the dissimilar. She proposed an alliance to the clans, not subjugation, not absorption, an alliance of equals, a common defense, common trade, an exchange of knowledge. Each tribe would remain itself, but together they would be greater. The delegations listened. They nodded. They whispered. They had come here for soap and iron. They left with something greater. Then Sola did something Daniel hadn't expected. She stopped, raised her hands to her neck, removed the jade disc, the ancient symbol of the Talgian chieftainess. For 200 years, this stone had been passed down from mother to daughter, from Hanil to her daughter, and on, all the way to Sola. The old woman held the disc in her open palms, heavy, green, warm from her neck. She turned toward Daniel, held it out. The square fell silent. Daniel looked at the disc, at Soleil, at her hands, ridged with wrinkles, trembling, strong. He shook his head, slowly. Soleil smiled, subtly, wearily, as if she knew, as if she had been expecting exactly that answer. She turned to Heijin. She walked over. She stood before her. She lifted the disc. She placed it around the warrior's neck. The jade rested against the skin above the new shoulder guard, above the collarbone that was no longer bleeding. Heijin stood there, hands at her sides, back straight. Her eyes were dry. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She stood there and bore the weight, not of a stone, but of responsibility. 200 years of history, 140 lives, and a new world that needed to be built. She looked at Daniel, over the heads of the people, through the torchlight, through everything that stood between them. Hatred, distrust, fear, concessions, small and large, a shoulder pad, a bowl of porridge, a nod, a name whispered, an arrow shot without orders to save him from his own decision. A year, 1 year, from hatred to this, to something that had no name, not love, not friendship, something else, something for which no language had yet invented a word. She said 2 words, stay by my side. Don't be my king. Don't be my husband. Don't be my advisor. Stay by my side. Daniel nodded, briefly, once, just as she used to nod to him, their language, without words. He stood beside her, not in front, not behind, beside her. Minsu held his hand. Tai stood on the other side of her sister and whispered something to So Young. They both giggled. 12 and 19. At the most solemn moment in the tribe's history, they were giggling. Daniel thought that was right, that this was exactly how it should be. Solemnity without laughter is pretentiousness, and pretentiousness is a lie. Enough with the lies. Miryu stood a little to the side. Her eyes were closed. Her face was turned toward the sky. She was smiling, quietly, calmly, like someone who had carried a burden for 20 years and could finally set it down. Not throw it down, set it down, gently, with respect for what she had carried, but to set it down. Now she has 4 students. Now children don't die in the winter. Now she can sleep until dawn. Now she can close her eyes and see not dead children, but stars through a glass lens. She has earned that smile. With every sleepless shift over the past 20 years. Bodon stood by the sacred stone, for the first time not as a priestess, as a woman. She did not recite the prayer she had memorized at 14. She stood and remained silent. And in that silence was more faith than in all the rituals she had performed over the past 10 years. Because the silence was hers, not an illness, not a fit, not someone else's words put into her mouth. Her own silence, her own choice. She opened her eyes. She looked at Daniel. He looked at her. She spoke the words, quietly, barely audible, but he understood. She said she believed. Not in spirits, not in ancestors, but in the fact that people can be better than they are. It was Bodon's first prayer that she herself believed in. Harim sat at the edge of the square, birch bark on her lap, a coal in her hand. She was writing. Every word of Sola, every gesture of Heijin, every nod from Daniel. The first chapter of Talgyon's new chronicle, not the old one, not the one built on lies, the new one, based on truth, on stone and iron and paper, on words that could be read 200 years from now without shame. She wrote, and her fingers did not tremble. 3 years ago, she had fled from Heian. For 3 years, she hadn't written a single word. She thought her mind was rusting away, that her voice had died. And then a man came. He brought paper. Silently, he placed it on the table, and her voice returned, stronger than before. She would finish this chronicle. She knew it. It was her work, her calling. Not a court scribe, the chronicler Talgyon. The square, torches, 200 people, 4 clans, 20 soldiers who chose freedom over orders, children who didn't die in winter, women who weren't afraid of men who weren't afraid of women, a boy holding the hand of the man who had become his father, and above it all, the scent, smoke from the torches, fresh bread that Daniel had taught her to bake a week ago, and spring, wet earth, living earth, the very earth which the garden beds grew and upon which the walls stood. Daniel stood next to Heijin and looked out at the square, at the people, at their faces, at the torches, at the sky above the torches. The stars were shining brightly. Meteor could see them through the lens. Bodon could pray to them without fear. Tai could ask questions about them until morning. Soyeon could run beneath them without limping. Harim could write about them on paper. Minsu could look at them not from a cage, but from home. Daniel remembered the truck, the wheelchair, the crash, the darkness, the voice. You're 200 years late, but better late than never. Ha, Neil. She had been waiting for him. 200 years. And he came. Late, but he came. Someone would ask him later. Daniel would be offered a title. Han, King of the Sarangway Confederation. He would refuse. He would choose another word. Sonsen-nim, teacher. They'll ask him why. He'll answer that kings come and go. Teachers live on in their students. By then, Tai will be standing next to a notebook full of drawings. Soyeon will be the chief healer after Medio. Minsu will draw maps better than Harim. Kyung-hee will forge iron more skillfully than Daniel himself. 20 archers would stand on the walls he designed, but which they built with their own hands. And each of them would know not only what to do, but also why. Because Daniel never just made things. He made things for specific people, and he taught those people to make things for others. But that would come later. Right now, he was standing in the square, next to Heijin. Minsu was holding his hand. The wind carried the scent of bread and smoke. And somewhere far beyond the mountains, in the capital of the kingdom of Heian, someone heard the name Sode-il for the first time, and frowned. But that's another story. This one had ended. Here, in the square, under the stars, by the warm hearth, among people who had ceased to be a tribe and had become a nation.